Make France great again. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 726, Inspection of Industrial Park. Forging small value banknotes to disrupt the market. You are quite a bold idea, old man. Jerome Bonaparte said to the old man across from him with an unsmiling smile. He could be sure that the old man in front of him was by no means an ordinary person, and his attitude towards the empire was also not very friendly. Bourbon? Orleans? Or Republican? Jerome Bonaparte secretly recalled the big figures and the three factions in his heart, but he couldn't match the number. However, he could probably rule out that the old man opposite was a Republican. Because the Republicans engage in intrigue and intrigue, it has always been a direct coup d'etat and a demonstration. It is rare to kill people in the financial field, but the all-night guys prefer this method. Regardless of the last years of the Orthodox Bourbon or the early days of the establishment of the Republic, the shadow of the Orleanists was indispensable. What's the use of thinking big? I'm just an old man waiting to die. After feeling the dangerous aura emanating from Jerome Bonaparte, the old man resolutely showed weakness to Jerome Bonaparte. He didn't want to let the wolf cubs of Bonaparte's family stare at him, who was overold and old. Otherwise, he would have to shed a layer of skin if he didn't die. I think the old gentleman is still very young. Jerome Bonaparte responded to the old man with a smile on his face. Prince Talleyrand, when he was 76 years old, could still take the initiative to asking to be the ambassador to the UK. In the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the status of the French ambassador to the UK is second only to the Foreign Secretary. If it is someone like Prince Talleyrand, then the status of the ambassador to the UK is not inferior to that of the Foreign Secretary. After hearing Prince Talleyrand, the old man's face showed a fleeting sadness, but this did not escape the eyes of Jerome Bonaparte. Did he know Talleyrand? Jerome Bonaparte thought to himself. How can I be compared with such a big man as Prince Talleyrand? The old man said with a self-deprecating smile. Right. It stands to reason that you should have met Prince Talleyrand. Jerome Bonaparte tried again. The old man couldn't help showing a touch of nostalgia, and then quickly covered it with a smile. How is it possible? His Excellency Talleyrand was a famous person back then. I'm just a nobody. Is that so? Jerome Bonaparte turned to ask the old man why he had traveled all the way to Paris. The old man told Jerome Bonaparte in a daze that the reason why he went to Paris was an invitation from an old friend. By the way, why did you go to Parisians? The old man also had some interest in the couple in front of him. Of course I'm going to Paris to see what's the way to be an official. After all, I'm famous, so it's not a pity not to go. Jerome Bonaparte answered the old man confidently. The words of Jerome Bonaparte caught the old man by surprise. He had thought that Jerome Bonaparte would make up a vacation as a guy's. Who knows? He actually said confidently that he was going to seek the official newspaper, which was indeed somewhat unexpected to him. It's good to be an official. It's good to be an official. The old man had to say dryly. Old man, are you interested in going with me? If I become a minister, you will be my assistant. Jerome Bonaparte tried to recruit the old man. The old man shook his head and replied to Jerome Bonaparte, I'm old. I've lost sight of worldly fame and fortune. Old man, this is different from what you just said. Jerome Bonaparte responded to the old man. What's different? The old man said suspiciously. You were accusing me just now that the knowledge you've learned is useless, and now you've become so dreadful of fame and fortune. Jerome Bonaparte responded to the old man. The old man just laughed. He didn't refute it. Then, after a moment of conversation with the old man, Jerome Bonaparte felt sleepy. Fascinated by the lake, he fell asleep on his seat. When Jerome Bonaparte woke up again, the train was still moving, and the old man sitting across from him had long since disappeared. What's the matter? Jerome Bonaparte asked Walewski, frowning. Your Majesty, he has quietly descended at the previous stop. Walewski replied to Jerome Bonaparte in a low voice. Then, why do you? Jerome Bonaparte was about to reprimand Walewski for not leaving him when he suddenly realized that he didn't seem to have a reason to keep the old man, and he could only whisper. He said, "What a cunning guy. That, your majesty." Walewski hesitated for a moment, then whispered into Jerome Bonaparte's ear, "You know, I used to play for the July dynasty." And then, said Jerome Bonaparte to Walewski, "I always feel like I've seen the old man you were chatting with just now." Walewski replied in a low voice to Jerome Bonaparte, "So, he's an audience?" Jerome Bonaparte replied to Walewski, frowning, "Should be." Walewski responded to Jerome Bonaparte in an uncertain tone, "Just think about where you saw him. When the time comes, tell me." Jerome Bonaparte urged again, and then closed his eyes again. Without the elderly, the whole journey became a little boring. Time passed quickly. At 9 a.m. the next day, after 26 hours, the intermittent train finally crossed the journey of nearly 900 kilometers and arrived at the Paris railway station. Jerome Bonaparte, who got off the train, looked up at the bright sunlight in the distance and couldn't help yawning. "Your Majesty." Walewski hurriedly changed his mind and asked Jerome Bonaparte, "Should we rent a carriage to go back?" "Go back? Why are you in such a hurry?" Jerome Bonaparte stretched his aching body and said to Walewski, "Let's raid the factory with me first." "Yes." Walewski, who had left the train station, called for a carriage and went to the suburbs of Paris with Jerome Bonaparte and Vernier Point. Shortly after Jerome Bonaparte and Walewski left, several soldiers in blue and white uniforms completely blocked the entire railway station. When the crowd who had not left the train station saw the group of soldiers in front of them, there was a slight disturbance immediately. General Weyne, who was in charge of blocking the scene, immediately issued an order to the people at the train station that only entry was allowed. "Princess Mathilde appears." "General Weyne, where is your majesty?" Queen Augusta, who had just got off the carriage, immediately asked General Weyne, "Your majesty, there is no trace of his majesty the emperor." General Weyne shook his head and replied to Queen Augusta, "Really? Jerome?" Mathilde complained in a low voice, "Don't he know who he is? How old is he? And he still does this kind of thing?" General Weyne lowered his head and dared not say a word. General Weyne, close the team. "I think Jerome should have left first." Queen Augusta gave an order to Weyne sternly. "Yes, your majesty." General Weyne ordered his soldiers to leave with Queen Augusta's carriage point. At this time, Jerome Bonaparte and Walewski had already arrived at the gate of Narinko Park. Walewski, who was the last to get off the carriage, took out a silver coin with Napoleon's face on it and said to the carriage, "Don't look for it." "Thank you very much, Mr. Kankeni. May God be with you," the coachman said to Verevsky with a smile. Jerome Bonaparte, Vernier and Walewski came to the gate of the park. The guard in charge of guarding the park immediately stopped Jerome Bonaparte and asked Jerome Bonaparte if he had the documents needed to enter the park. "No." Jerome Bonaparte shook his head, then took off his wig and eyes and said with a smile, "I don't know. Can I be invited in with this face?" "Your majesty." The two guards immediately turned pale in shock and bowed to Jerome Bonaparte to show their respect. "You reading www.ukanshu.com, get up," said Jerome Bonaparte, raising his hand slightly to them. "Thank you, your majesty." The guard stood up and replied to Jerome Bonaparte. Afterwards, the guard opened the gate of the park and Jerome Bonaparte was able to enter the park. "Your majesty, do you want me to call General Manager Basilio?" the guard hurriedly said to Jerome Bonaparte. "No need for this." Jerome Bonaparte shook his head. "I'm very familiar with all the places here." The guard had no choice but to give up. Jerome Bonaparte and Walewski went all the way into the park and finally reached the first place he wanted to inspect. When Jerome Bonaparte and Walewski entered the Umbrella Research Base, they were immediately discovered by the staff of the research base. "Your majesty." The staff was surprised when they saw Jerome Bonaparte and then quickly saluted Jerome Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte slightly and led by the staff, Jerome Bonaparte came to the living room. After a while, a man in a white coat and a cotton mask appeared in front of Jerome Bonaparte. "Professor Pasteur." Jerome Bonaparte greeted Louis Pasteur with a smile. "Your majesty, when did you come back?" Louis Pasteur asked Jerome Bonaparte while taking off his mask and salute. "Just now." Jerome Bonaparte responded to Louis Pasteur, "I will run here, as soon as I get off the train." Then, Jerome Bonaparte asked Louis Pasteur about malaria. Louis Pasteur told him that, although they already knew the transmission vector of malaria, there had been no major breakthrough in the treatment of malaria. Chapter 727, Artificial Dyes by Accident. For now, the artificial synthesis of quinine is still in the groping stage. Louis Pasteur sighed softly and replied to Jerome Bonaparte in a low voice. It can be seen from his expression that Professor Pasteur is very dissatisfied with the current research progress. Jerome Bonaparte, who knew that malaria research was a long and tortuous road, did not blame Louis Pasteur at all, but rather admired Professor Pasteur to know that the identification of malaria transmission vectors in history has to wait more than 40 years. It is quite remarkable that Professor Louis Pasteur was able to find out the African malaria vector in the shortest possible time under the existing conditions. Although under the premise that Jerome Bonaparte provided ideas for Louis Pasteur, "Professor, there is no rush for scientific research." Jerome Bonaparte gently patted Louis Pasteur's shoulder and said solemnly, "Any research is difficult to obtain without going through thousands of experiments. Result, my healing game. Trust me, inspiration will pop into your head after you have accumulated hundreds of experiments. Your Majesty, you have given me really high treatment and provided me with so many assistants, but I have failed you." Louis Pasteur whispered to Jerome Bonaparte, "Professor Pasteur." Jerome Bonaparte responded to Louis Pasteur with a serious face, "You have not failed anyone. Everything you have now is the honor you deserve. I have always believed that the strength of a country is not only in us who are in high positions, but also in you. A country that respects science and is willing to invest in science can truly have a better tomorrow." Under Jerome Bonaparte's chicken soup for the soul, Louis Pasteur, who had been depressed because he was unable to overcome malaria, immediately regained his strength. Immediately afterwards, Louis Pasteur told Jerome Bonaparte, "Although they have not yet thoroughly researched artificial quinine, they have summarized the transmission route of malaria and the methods of preventing malaria. It is believed that with this set of methods, the mortality rate will be reduced. On behalf of the French government, I thank you for your efforts." Jerome Bonaparte said excitedly, clasping Louis Pasteur's hand. If Louis Pasteur's method proves effective, then Jerome Bonaparte's plan to colonize Africa could be on the agenda. At this time, Louis Pasteur had no idea how much suffering his research was about to bring to those living in Africa. Of Africans brought civilization. "I'm just doing what I can do," Louis Pasteur said shyly. "Speak. What do you want?" Jerome Bonaparte said generously to Louis Pasteur, "Your Majesty, this is not just me, but everyone in this institute." Louis Pasteur replied to Jerome Bonaparte, still retaining the simple values of happiness and sharing, "Okay, I see." Jerome Bonaparte nodded and said to Louis Pasteur, "I can assure you that you will receive another huge bonus." Hearing Jerome Bonaparte's words, smiles appeared on the faces of everyone present. When it comes to rewarding scientific researchers, Jerome Bonaparte has never been stingy. It is precisely because of this that they are willing to work harder for Jerome Bonaparte. Any company that only likes to talk about ideals and is unwilling to discuss treatment will face collapse sooner or later. The most hated sentence of Jerome Bonaparte in the previous life was, "The narrower the heart is than the treatment, the higher the realm is." When it comes to dedication, this act of turning treatment and devotion into a binary opposition is either stupid or bad. Afterwards, Jerome Bonaparte spoke with Louis Pasteur for a while and asked him if there was anything else he could do for him. Louis Pasteur shook his head and said that there is no need to trouble Jerome Bonaparte at the moment. Just as Jerome Bonaparte was about to say goodbye to Louis Pasteur and head to the next inspection site, an institute staff member wearing a mask hurriedly ran from the underground institute to the living room. "Professor," the researcher shouted to Louis Pasteur, panting, and then bowed to Jerome Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte stopped and hurriedly asked the researcher, "What happened to the underground research institute? Did the sample leak?" The researcher shook his head and replied to Jerome Bonaparte, "Your Majesty, when we were experimenting with artificial quinine, we accidentally made something interesting." "What?" Jerome Bonaparte asked curiously. "Your Majesty, if you don't mind, it is convenient to move to the underground laboratory." The researcher said to Jerome Bonaparte. What? Are you showing off? Louis Pasteur frowned slightly and reprimanded the researcher. Do you know that your majesty's time is precious? After the researcher heard Louis Pasteur's reprimand, he lowered his head and did not speak. Professor, don't go online like this. Jerome Bonaparte hurriedly made a clearance for him, but Professor Louis Pasteur responded. Give me. Jerome Bonaparte glanced at Vernier and Walewski beside him. He stretched out his hand and said to the researcher, give me 3 masks. Yes. The researcher took out 3 cotton masks from his pocket and handed them to Jerome Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte gave 2 masks to Vernier and Walewski respectively and then put another mask on. Let's go. Professor Pasteur. Jerome Bonaparte said to Louis Pasteur. Let's see what they're up to. Louis Pasteur had to put on a mask and follow Jerome Bonaparte to the underground institute point under the leadership of the institute staff. Jerome Bonaparte and others came to a room in the institute point at this time. The room was crowded with researchers in white lab coats. Seeing that there was no way forward, the researcher shouted at the top of his voice, let me go. Let me go. Your Majesty and Professor Pasteur are here. The researchers standing in the front row subconsciously looked back after hearing this sentence. Sure enough, Jerome Bonaparte and Louis Pasteur were behind them. Everyone, please let me go. Jerome Bonaparte took a step forward and said to them softly, don't you have your own work here? Louis Pasteur reprimanded them with a hint of anger. After hearing Louis Pasteur's reprimand, most of the institute staff immediately turned and left. Soon there were only a few people left in the room, and Jerome Bonaparte and the others also looked at the contents of the test tube on the test bench. This is not. Jerome Bonaparte stared at the contents of the test tube, then quickly walked to the test bench, pointed to the test tube and asked, who made this? Several researchers pointed to one of them at the same time, and the researcher said timidly, Your Majesty, I made this. However, I made it unintentionally. Do you remember how this thing was made? Jerome Bonaparte asked in a slightly hasty tone. Remember. The researcher nodded, and then described to Jerome Bonaparte what he added when he made it. I remember that I just added potassium dichromate to aniline in order to extract quinine sulfate, and then there was a bitumen colored residue in the flask, and I knew the experiment must have failed. So, in order to wash off that residue, I wanted to use alcohol. Who knew that, as soon as the alcohol was added, they turned into the purple they are now? That's right. That's it, said Jerome Bonaparte excitedly. Unexpectedly, I asked them to study the production of artificial quinine, but by accident, the aniline violet was restored. This is the first man-made synthetic dye. Your Majesty, what exactly does this thing do? Louis Pasteur looked at the aniline violet reagent doubtfully. Quick, bring me all the white fabrics in the research room. Jerome Bonaparte immediately urged Louis Pasteur. He wanted to verify whether it was real or not. Aniline violet. Louis Pasteur hurriedly started talking, and the researcher who developed aniline violet was a little flustered. He didn't expect to make such a big fuss. What's your name? Jerome Bonaparte asked the somewhat immature researcher with a kind smile on his face. William Henry Parkin. The researcher responded timidly in half-baked French. He's a Briton, recommended by the headmaster of the Royal Academy of Chemistry. Louis Pasteur hurriedly explained. I admire academician Liebig in particular, so. William Henry Parkin stammered to Jerome Bonaparte. In 1852, Eurytus von Liebig, who was deeply persecuted, was expelled from the Kingdom of Prussia, and was immediately invited by Jerome Bonaparte to France, to serve as the Dean of the Department of Chemistry at the École Polytechnique. Are you interested in studying for a bachelor's degree at the École Polytechnique? Jerome Bonaparte asked with a smile. Is it really possible? William Henry Parkin asked excitedly. Of course. Jerome Bonaparte nodded. We welcome every scholar to France. After a while, the staff of the research institute brought all the white cloth over. Jerome Bonaparte dripped the aniline violet reagent on the cotton, wool, and silk in turn, and then let it dry for a while. After it was completely infected, the staff of the research institute were ordered to find a few basins of water. Jerome Bonaparte put them into different basins, and sure enough, except for the cotton cloth, neither the wool nor the silk showed any signs of fading. Mr. Parkin, you're going to make a fortune. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 728, More's a Rear Loading Gun 1.0. Make a fortune? William Parkin, who had not turned his head around, looked at Jerome Bonaparte blankly. He did not understand what effect his failed experiment could have. That's right. Jerome Bonaparte explained to William Parkin, at present, most of the dyes we use are natural dyes. They are not only expensive, but also rare. The price of the dyes you make is lower than that of natural dyes. The reduction of dyes not only means lower production costs, but also means that the dyes you make will be more popular in the market. Every commodity that is favored by the market, their prospects are not too big. So Mr. Parkin, can you sell me this technology? Sell? Parkin looked at Jerome Bonaparte in surprise. In his opinion, aniline violet came from the laboratory and should be something in the laboratory. This is something that belongs to you, and of course we have to discuss it with you. Jerome Bonaparte persuaded. What do you think? Is 100,000 francs plus 10%? No. What about the 15% stake in the dye company? William Henry Parkin looked at Jerome Bonaparte dully. For Parkin, who was born into a middle-class family, 100,000 francs would require their entire family to work for about 5 years to save enough, not to mention a 15% stake in the fuel company. Parkin believed that the company opened by the emperor would not be a small company. Not satisfied? Jerome Bonaparte thought to himself, 150,000 francs plus 17% of the shares. Jerome Bonaparte once again quoted a brand new price point this time. Not only Parkin, but everyone including Louis Pasteur was surprised by Jerome Bonaparte's handwriting. These are my investments in you. Jerome Bonaparte patted Parkin on the shoulder. I can assure you that after you finish your Bachelor of Chemistry at École Polytechnique, you will be awarded the title of professor, and the newly established dye company will also make you the chief consultant. Facing such lucrative conditions as Jerome Bonaparte, Parkin immediately chose to surrender. I do. Very high. Jerome Bonaparte responded kindly to Parkin. Mr. Parkin, I will let Basilio sign an agreement with you. Your Majesty, can I continue to work here? Parkin asked Jerome Bonaparte nervously. Of course. Mr. Parkin. Jerome Bonaparte replied to Parkin, and then turned to Parkin. However, Mr. Parkin, I don't think your future lies in artificial quinine, but on artificial dyes. I believe in your talent. Your Majesty, I still want to try it. Parkin said firmly to Jerome Bonaparte. Although he knew that he might be better at making a difference in artificial dyes, he was still unwilling to leave the path of artificial quinine. I think he was sent to Louis Pasteur's laboratory for further studies with the idea of treating malaria. Yes. Jerome Bonaparte nodded in agreement with Parkin's request. Immediately after, Jerome Bonaparte and Louis Pasteur talked for a while, and under the asterisk of Louis Pasteur, Jerome Bonaparte and others left the Umbrella Institute. Walking on the road, Vernier curiously asked Jerome Bonaparte why he did business with Parkin's homework. He could obviously grab aniline violet from Parkin's hands. Vernier, we must respect other scientific research results. Jerome Bonaparte responded to Vernier. Blindly stealing is not something a smart person should do, but he works in the institute. Vernier responded confidently to Jerome Bonaparte. Working in the institute can take away all the fruits of others' labor. Jerome Bonaparte recalled some asterisk things in his previous life and laughed angrily. You have to remember that the most precious thing in the world is not the research results, but the people who achieve the research results. Then, Jerome Bonaparte made a pun. The most precious thing in the 19th century was people. What's so precious about people? Vernier responded dismissively. I think we have too many people now. Not much. Not much. Not much at all. Jerome Bonaparte shook his head and said, I wish the current population of France can be equal to that of Russia. If the population continues like this, it will be a little dangerous. Dangerous? What's the danger? Too many people are really dangerous. Vernier said to Jerome Bonaparte. The danger of few people Jerome Bonaparte recalled France's population of 39.6 million before the First World War, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency in his heart. If the French population cannot be equalized with the German population, then the German population can only be made equal to the French population. Only when Germany is completely leveled can the security of the entire France be truly guaranteed. When the time comes, you'll know, Jerome Bonaparte said sternly, then stopped at the door of the Mauser Firearms Manufacturing Company. Go in. After Jerome Bonaparte and Vernier entered the interior of Mauser's company, in fact, it was a larger courtyard, old Mauser and Chasuble appeared in front of Jerome Bonaparte. Your Majesty, when did you return to Paris? Old Mauser asked the same question as Louis Pasteur. Just got back. Jerome Bonaparte responded to the old Mauser, and then asked the old Mauser, where is the research progress of the new rifle, Your Majesty? With the unremitting efforts of our team, the new rifle has reached the stage of the first round of testing. Old Mauser replied to Jerome Bonaparte, the guard is here so fast. Jerome Bonaparte looked at the old Mauser with a solemn face. He didn't believe that the old Mauser made the classic rifle so quickly. Has the rifle been made now? Show me. Your Majesty, can you wait until the test results come out? Old Mauser was worried that the bolt-action rifle he had made was not in line with Jerome Bonaparte's wishes. Why wait until the test results come out? Jerome Bonaparte responded to old Mauser, where's the rifle? I can't test it myself. At the request of Jerome Bonaparte, the old Mauser had to order his son to hand over the rifle that had been made but had not been tested to Jerome Bonaparte. Judging from the style of the entire rifle, the rifle involved by old Mauser still has a shadow of a Delis needle gun. No way, the only breech gun that has barely succeeded on the market is a Delis firing needle gun. Whether it is the historical Chasuble rifle or the Mauser 1871 rifle has more or less been influenced by Deris. There are clearly more Mauser element in the rifle, though. Your Majesty, we have improved the firing pin according to your instructions, so that the firing pin can hang up when it is pulled back. Old Mauser pointed to the Mauser rifle and explained to Jerome Bonaparte word by word road. After the old Mauser finished his explanation, Jerome Bonaparte responded to the old Mauser, Mr. Mauser, let's go to the field to actually test it for a while. It's a mule or a horse, and we always have to pull it out for a walk. Take a walk. Yes. Old Mauser nodded and replied to Jerome Bonaparte. Afterwards, old Mauser, Chasuble, and a group of engineers from Mauser Firearms Factory followed Jerome Bonaparte and others to the shooting range. By the way, what is the range of your rifle? Jerome Bonaparte asked old Mauser. This still needs to be tested. Old Mauser responded embarrassingly, and then added, however, it must be farther than the range of the Deris rifle. Then, Jerome Bonaparte thought for a while, then said to old Mauser, come 200 meters first, give it a try. Jerome Bonaparte stood in front of the target first, then kept retreating backwards. When he was about 200 meters away from the target, Jerome Bonaparte stopped. Take a gun aiming gesture. From the point of view of the weight of the gun, the weight of the Mauser rear-loading gun is lighter than that of the Deris rifle. Actually, it was Jerome Bonaparte's illusion. The weight of the entire gun body was only 0.02 kilograms different from that of Deris bullets. Jerome Bonaparte stretched out his hand and said to the old Mauser beside him. Old Mauser hurriedly handed Jerome Bonaparte a fixed cartridge wrapped in oiled paper. Seeing the incomparably huge bullet in his hand, Jerome Bonaparte was taken aback for a moment and then asked old Mauser why he didn't use brass bullets. Old Mauser told Jerome Bonaparte that he had already sent someone to get brass bullets and asked Jerome Bonaparte to use paper shell bullets to test fire first. Jerome Bonaparte nodded, then turned and pulled back, opened Mauser and loaded the gun. While turning and pulling, Jerome Bonaparte clearly heard the sound of the firing pin being caught by something, and then stuffed the cartridge into it. When Jerome Bonaparte put the paper packaged fixed loading cartridge into it, he discovered that there was still a ring of rubber on the firing pin, which should have been specially added to prevent air leakage. After all, paper-packed bullets are different from brass bullets, which produce far more smoke than the latter. Only after smokeless powder and brass bullets are designed, the gap between the rear-loading gun and the front-loading gun will become a sky and an underground. Jerome Bonaparte, who had inserted the paper-packed fixed load cartridge, pulled the breech gun back again, then aimed at the distant target, and pulled the trigger. Hearing the sound of boom, there was a slight vibration from Morse's rear gun, and a large amount of smoke floated out. At the same time, there was an extra bullet hole in the distant target. Chapter 729, a near-perfect reloading gun. Looking at the target with a bullet hole left in the distance, Jerome Bonaparte's face was slightly embarrassed, because the bullet fired from Morse's rear-loading rifle almost missed the target. Walewski, who was standing on the side, did not feel embarrassed at all. He immediately applauded and flattered Jerome Bonaparte. "Okay, Your Majesty, good marksmanship." The old Morser and his sons, who had reacted, also began to applaud, praising Jerome Bonaparte's red sunset marksmanship. Haha. Jerome Bonaparte felt even more embarrassed, so he handed a paper-packed fixed-loading bomb to Walewski, and said to Walewski with a kind-hearted look, "Minister Walewski, tried to." Walewski was stunned for a moment, and then took the paper-packaged fixed-loading ammunition and Morser rear-loading gun that Jerome Bonaparte handed him. As Walewski pulled away Morser and loaded the gun, a plume of white smoke floated out of the barrel. "Let's get started," Jerome Bonaparte said sternly, and then added, "Walewski, I know your shooting ability, so you came to the lake with a miss." As soon as he said this, Walewski immediately had a feeling of shooting himself in the foot. Why did he have to boast just now? Now the Emperor will not allow him to miss the target. Seeing that he couldn't get out of the way, Walewski had to bite the bullet and put the paper-packed fixed-loading bullet into the barrel of the gun, then close the barrel and started to aim at the target in the distance, while thinking in his mind about not missing the target. Under the circumstance, he scored even worse than the Emperor, and Jerome Bonaparte exchanged his arms with old Morser. "Mr. Morser, Your Majesty, what are your orders?" Old Morser asked Jerome Bonaparte. "That's right, Mr. Morser, just now I saw a piece of rubber on the firing pin of this Morser rifle, and I was thinking about how to replace it with brass bullets. How should you ensure that the brass bullets can be smoothly drawn?" Jerome Bonaparte asked old Morser, "And I don't see the extraction mechanism on your rifle." After a moment of silence, old Morser responded to Jerome Bonaparte, "Your Majesty, this rifle does not have a shell extraction mechanism. Speaking of which, this is a product that is completely shot for cardboard shells." Jerome Bonaparte asked old Morser again. "Yes, Your Majesty." Old Morser nodded and responded to Jerome Bonaparte, "Can you tell me why you didn't follow the design ideas I gave you?" Jerome Bonaparte asked old Morser with a serious look. "Small book boo, Your Majesty, it's not my father's fault." Paul Morser asked Jerome Bonaparte for sin. "It's all my fault, Paul. I don't mean to ask for guilt." Jerome Bonaparte immediately realized that there was something wrong with his attitude. He quickly corrected it and replied to Paul Morser, "I mean, you are in. Which one is in trouble?" Paul Morser told Jerome Bonaparte that they had some difficulties with the metal cartridges. Although it has been more than 20 years since the earliest appearance of metal fixed-loading bombs, the earliest in the 1830s, it was not really developed until the 1850s. That is to say, the development time of the entire metal fixed-loading ammunition is only about 5 years, so there are many technical problems in the metal fixed-loading ammunition that need to be solved. If the problem of metal fixed-loading ammunition is not solved, then even if the shell extraction mechanism is completed now, major adjustments will be required in the later stage. Instead, it's better to test other performance first. Wait until the metal fixed-loading bomb is completely formed, and then think about the shell extraction mechanism. And the addition of the magazine has to wait until the extraction mechanism is resolved, and then solve it. "I see." Jerome Bonaparte nodded and responded to Paul Morser. At this moment, a gunshot came, and Jerome Bonaparte shifted his attention from the Morsers to the target. "I saw another small black spot on the target more than 200 meters away from Jerome Bonaparte, and the position of the black spot was also on the edge of the target." "Your Majesty." Verusky let out a sigh of relief as he put down the Morser rear-loading gun in his hand. "Not bad. Not bad." Jerome Bonaparte glanced at the sweat on Walewski's forehead and pointed out, "It's really hard for you." "It's not hard. It's not hard." Walewski showed a slightly embarrassed smile on his face. "This shot really cost him too much energy. It can be said to be the hardest shot ever." "Okay. Wipe it off." The sweat is about to drip down your chin. Jerome Bonaparte said sternly, then took the rifle in Walewski's hand. Just as Jerome Bonaparte was about to test a shot, the man sent to get the brass bullet appeared and handed the bullet to old Morza. Your Majesty, the bullets are coming. Old Morza handed some brass bullets to Jerome Bonaparte. Relying on the brass bullet with a diameter of about 11 mm in his hand, after the smokeless powder was not produced, the diameter of the bullet was generally larger than that of the smokeless powder. Jerome Bonaparte hesitated for a moment, and then put the copper bullet was returned to old Morza. Your Majesty, are you not going to continue the experiment? Old Morza asked Jerome Bonaparte suspiciously. I'll wait for you to finish making the shell extraction mechanism, and then I'll test it. Jerome Bonaparte replied to the old Morza, the focus of the test now is the range of the rifle. Then, Jerome Bonaparte ordered Walewski to call in the veterans who were patrolling the industrial park. The veterans first saluted Jerome Bonaparte, and then asked Jerome Bonaparte what he ordered. Jerome Bonaparte randomly assigned a person, and handed him the Morza rear-loading gun and 3 paper-packed cartridges. Now, I want you to shoot at the targets at about 300. 400 and 500 meters respectively. Jerome Bonaparte pointed to the distant target and ordered the veteran. Your Majesty, take a good look at it. Back then, so did I. The old soldier patted his chest and boasted to Jerome Bonaparte. Then the veteran walked to a place about 300 meters, opened the paper package in his hand, and wanted to pour it into the barrel of the gun. Wait a minute. Jerome Bonaparte hurriedly stopped his heartbeat. Under the doubtful gaze of the veteran, Jerome Bonaparte pointed to the breech of the Morza rifle and said to the veteran, this type of rifle does not need a paper casing, it just needs to be stuffed into the rifle as a whole. Your Majesty, is this a breech gun? The veteran asked Jerome Bonaparte with wide eyes. Yes. Jerome Bonaparte nodded. What's the matter? Is there any difficulty? No. The veteran shook his head to Jerome Bonaparte, and then couldn't help reminding, Your Majesty, I heard that the performance of the rear-mounted gun is far inferior to the front-mounted gun. It depends on which aspect of performance you are talking about. Jerome Bonaparte replied to the veteran with a smile. If you only evaluate the power and range, the current rear-mounted guns really cannot be compared with the front-mounted guns. In 1866, the Tsar's Sabo rifle had the same range as the Migul gun, and its power was slightly inferior to the Mignet gun, but you're talking about rate of fire and other things. A rear-loading gun is far better than a front-loading one, and the potential of the rear-loading gun is far greater than the front-loading. However, I remember my previous commander said he would rather die than use a rear-loading gun. The veteran said to Jerome Bonaparte again. Indeed, under the premise that the rear-loading gun has not experienced actual combat, Dries also lost face in Almaty, it is difficult for the conservative forces in the army to let a rice that has experienced the test of the Crimean War, Nirvana rifle completely withdraws from the stage. It's up to them. Jerome Bonaparte responded firmly. As long as the technology of metal fixed loading ammunition and Morza rifles are all mature, he will implement it to the whole army. Don't let anyone stop him. The veteran is not talking. You reading www.wakanshu.com started stuffing bullets into the breech point after a while. Gunshots rang out, and Jerome Bonaparte immediately used the telescope to observe point through the telescope. Jerome Bonaparte found that there was another bullet hole on the target more than 300 meters away from him, and the bullet hole was very close to the bullseye. Very good. Jerome Bonaparte patted the veteran on the shoulder. You were indeed a good player in the army before. The veteran smiled and ran to the target 400 meters away for a second shot point. This time the shooting was obviously not as good as the last time. The bullet hole was already very close to the edge of the target point. When the veteran ran more than 500 meters away from the target, Jerome Bonaparte immediately ordered him to change the target. The veteran was not shooting the target, but the big tree behind the target, which was much easier to shoot than the target. This is no problem. The veteran raised his gun again, and soon there was also an additional bullet hole in the tree. Go on. Jerome Bonaparte ordered the veteran to retreat to 600 meters. This time the bullet hole was on the edge of the tree. A surprised look appeared on the veteran's face. Having used the Migul, he understood that the range was almost the same as that of the Mignote point. This also means that this reloading gun can completely replace the ecological niche of the miner gun, and his reload speed is faster than the miner gun. Very good. Jerome Bonaparte nodded, then said to the veteran, "You can leave now." The veteran handed the Mauser's reloading gun to Jerome Bonaparte and left, and Jerome Bonaparte said to the old Mauser, "Mr. Mauser, to be honest, your rifle has been fully capable of to the point of replacing the Mignote rifle. I really have a hard time believing that you can make such a perfect piece in such a short period of time." Chapter 730, West African Expedition Imagined. Your Majesty, you are overrated. This is only a preliminary design, and it is far from your regulations. A shy smile appeared on the corner of old Mauser's mouth, and he humbly responded to Jerome Bonaparte. "By the way, if I equip this rifle into the army in advance, can the improved version be directly carried out on this rifle?" Jerome Bonaparte then asked old Mauser. After being silent for a while, old Mauser replied tactfully to Jerome Bonaparte, "Your Majesty, I'm not good at answering this. For any firearm, there is still some gap between the preliminary design and the final product. If the difference is not too big, it is very easy to improve. If the difference is large, then there may be some difficulties in improving it." Old Mauser's words reminded Jerome Bonaparte of the Chasipo rifle thrown in history. It was born at the wrong time and only went through a few wars before it was directly into the Cold Palace point. Although the later grass rifles were modified on the basis of the Sabo rifles, the cost of improvement was not low at all. However, the performance is still not as good as the Mauser rifles of the period. Then, just wait. Jerome Bonaparte gave up the idea of large-scale equipment, and then asked the old Mauser rifle if there was a possibility of small-scale mass production. Old Mauser told Jerome Bonaparte that, as long as the factories in the industrial park are willing to cooperate, small-scale mass production is not a problem at all. "I will let the factories in the park cooperate with you as much as possible." Jerome Bonaparte said to old Mauser, "You only need to manufacture more than 1,000 rifles for the first batch. Jerome Bonaparte is going to use these more than 1,000 rifles to arm an expedition, and then infiltrate West and Central Africa in the name of scientific investigation. This can not only meet the performance test of new weapons, but also can justifiably colonize Central and West Africa." He believed that with breech guns and quinine, France would be able to conquer the lands of Central and West Africa like history. "Yes, Your Majesty." Old Mauser nodded and said to Jerome Bonaparte, "Also, rifles and metal fixed loading ammunition must not be slack in the slightest. I will let Basilio continue to increase investment for you." Jerome Bonaparte once again warned, and then added in a sentence, "And in view of your performance this time, I will award you the 4th class Glory Legion medal, equivalent to being a knight. I hope you can make persistent efforts." Old Mauser, who heard that he was canonized as a member of the nobility, immediately smiled. He didn't expect that he would become a member of the nobility so quickly. Although the French knighthood is not too precious, it is still a symbol of honor. As long as he can make persistent efforts, there is no possibility that he will be canonized as a baron. Subsequently, Jerome Bonaparte and old Mauser returned to the firearms manufacturing company. On the way back, Jerome Bonaparte asked old Mauser if he would give him the rifle numbered 0001. Old Mauser said very politely that if Jerome Bonaparte likes it, he can take this rifle away. "Then, I'll accept it." Jerome Bonaparte said unceremoniously to old Mauser, and then asked old Mauser the progress of his work on the multi-barrel cannon. During this time, Mr. Sabo has been following me in designing a rifle, so the multi-barrel cannon is still being designed. Old Mauser hurriedly smoothed out Sabo's way. "No wonder," Jerome Bonaparte murmured in a low voice. He said why there was rubber on Mauser's rear-mounted gun. It turned out to be Sabo's idea. "Your Majesty, do you want me to call him here?" Old Mauser asked Jerome Bonaparte. "There's no need for that." Jerome Bonaparte shook his head and rejected old Mauser's suggestion, then took out his pocket watch and glanced at the time. It was already around 11:30 noon, and before he knew it, 2.5 hours had passed since he got off the train. "Walewski, Vernier, we should go." Jerome Bonaparte hurriedly greeted Walewski and Vernier to leave. "If I don't leave, I'm afraid I will go back to accept Augusta's scolding." "Your Majesty, I will send you off. Old Morza sent Jerome Bonaparte to the crossroads. The trio of Jerome Bonaparte went to Basilio's office. Basilio, who had been waiting in the office for a long time, immediately went to meet Jerome Bonaparte in person. After receiving the news of Jerome Bonaparte's arrival, Jerome Bonaparte quickly explained the task to Basilio. 1. Immediately open a dye company in the park and grant 150,000 francs plus 17% of the shares to the William Parkin Institute of the Umbrella Institute. Yes. Now, you have to draw up a patent contract, which is not a single patent, but all the patents of William Parkin in the next 30 years too. Give 150,000 francs to the Umbrella Research Institute and the Old Morza Firearms Company respectively. The reward. Do you understand? Yes, Your Majesty. I will execute it immediately. Basilio hurriedly replied to Jerome Bonaparte. By the way, Your Majesty, that William Parkin has created a synthetic purple dye in the laboratory that works on silk, said Jerome Bonaparte to Basilio. Basilio instantly smelled the scent of money. If this dye is put on the market, it will definitely sell. That's right. Jerome Bonaparte nodded. After the signing is completed, you can go to Britain and Germany to apply for a patent. If the application is late, I'm afraid that something will change. The change in Jerome Bonaparte's mouth refers to the fact that during this time, someone also developed the same dye. After all, there are too many asterisk things on the European continent for patents. As far as the current steel-making law is concerned, Norinco is arguing with William Kelly in Britain over this issue. William Kelly has always demanded that the new steel-making method should be stopped from profiting in Britain on the grounds that the steel-making method was his first point. Although Jerome Bonaparte, William Kelly was just someone who was pushed out by some steel giants in Britain to fight in the ring. He could not directly strangle him through official force. Guys like William Kelly, while they can't get you in the way, will keep boring you like flies. Jerome Bonaparte doesn't want too many guys like William Kelly. Your Majesty, does the United States of America still need to apply for a patent? Basilio asked again. Apply? Why don't you apply? Jerome Bonaparte said to Basilio through gritted teeth. Tell us the lawyers in the United States of America. If anyone dares to steal technology without the permission of the company, we don't care who it is. No matter how small the scale, one will sue the other until they go bankrupt. Your Majesty, if we sue company by company, I'm afraid that all our interests in the United States of America will be invested in a long lawsuit. Basilio reminded Jerome Bonaparte pointers relying on piracy to start the United States of America. There are still all kinds of small factories left at this time. They have no fear of patent law and carry out piracy work recklessly. It's not an easy task to knock all these guys down. It's worth the investment. Jerome Bonaparte said unswervingly, we can only make more profits if we are unswervingly clear about piracy. Basilio finally followed Jerome Bonaparte's advice. Okay, that's all I have to say. Jerome Bonaparte shrugged and said to Basilio, now you can find a car and take me back. Basilio quickly arranged a carriage for Jerome Bonaparte. Not only that, but he also equipped Jerome Bonaparte with several veterans who were responsible for escorting him back. Forget it. Jerome Bonaparte shook his head and said to Basilio, if you send too many people, anyone with a discerning eye will see that there is a heavy weight in the carriage. You are not increasing my danger in disguise. I was negligent. Basilio hurriedly apologized to Jerome Bonaparte and dismissed the soldiers who had escorted Jerome Bonaparte back. In this way, Jerome Bonaparte and Vernier took a carriage back to the Tuileries Palace, while Walewski returned to the Orsay Pier in another carriage. When Jerome Bonaparte's carriage arrived in the garden of the Tuileries Palace, the patrolling guards who were in charge of guarding the garden immediately blocked the carriage's way forward. Please show your invitation. I don't have an invitation letter. I'm sorry, you can't go in. Jerome Bonaparte, who was sitting in the carriage, heard the conversation between the driver and the patrolling guards. He opened the curtains, put his head close to the windowsill, and said half jokingly, can I get in with this image? The guards immediately looked towards the carriage when they heard the sound, and when they saw Jerome Bonaparte's face, their expressions changed greatly, and then they saluted Jerome Bonaparte in the carriage. Your Majesty. Okay, get out of the way. Jerome Bonaparte in the carriage waved his hand to the patrolling guards. The patrolling guards hurriedly made way for the carriage, and the carriage arrived at the gate of the Tuileries Palace. Jerome Bonaparte pushed open the car door and went straight into the courtyard of the Tuileries Palace. On the first floor, Moquet, who was instructing the servants of the Tuileries Palace, saw Jerome Bonaparte. His face immediately showed a happy smile. "Your Majesty, Mocha, where is my lovely son Frederick now?" "Take him there." Jerome Bonaparte asked Mocha straight to the point. PLZ. Follow me. Chapter 731. Meet at last. Under the leadership of Mocha, Jerome Bonaparte arrived at the gate of Queen Augusta's bedroom. "Mocha, why is Friedrich's room with Augusta's?" Jerome Bonaparte asked Mocha in a low voice. "His Majesty." Mocha smiled bitterly and told Jerome Bonaparte that they had already equipped professional people to serve the Crown Prince's daily life before His Royal Highness was born. Her Majesty the Queen and Princess Mathilde did not agree with the people he was looking for to take care of Prince Frederick's daily life, and they had to choose to take turns taking care of Prince Frederick. The bedroom originally built for Crown Prince Frederick remains uninhabited, and Crown Prince Frederick moved to Queen Augusta's room for the convenience of Queen Augusta and Princess Mathilde care. "Isn't this nonsense?" Jerome Bonaparte couldn't help but muttered in a low voice. Neither his wife, Augusta, nor his sister, Mathilde, had any experience with babysitting at all. Of course, not only a lot of their royal nobles also have no experience in taking care of children. So in Jerome Bonaparte's view, letting those noble ladies take care of their children is simply a scourge of children's childhood. "Your Majesty, in fact, Her Majesty Queen Augusta and Her Royal Highness Princess Mathilde take good care of you. No, in some respects, they are almost the same as those who advise you to professionally engage in this type of work." Mocha couldn't help it. In defense of Queen Augusta and Princess Mathilde. You sure you didn't lie to me?" Jerome Bonaparte looked at Mocha suspiciously. He had a hard time believing that two ladies with no fingers were able to handle the difficult task of taking care of a baby. "Your Majesty, I can assure you," Mocha hurriedly replied to Jerome Bonaparte, "if it were not for the talents of Your Majesty and His Highness to be competent for the job, the subordinate would not be at ease in handing over His Royal Highness the Crown Prince to them." In Mocha's heart, the most important thing in the empire is Jerome Bonaparte. After Jerome Bonaparte is Crown Prince Frederick, while Queen Augusta and Mathilde the princess was placed behind Crown Prince Frederick and far behind Crown Prince Frederick. "I believe in you." Jerome Bonaparte patted Mocha on the shoulder and said solemnly to him. Mocha, who felt the trust of Jerome Bonaparte, warmed his heart and then reminded Jerome Bonaparte to enter the room as soon as possible. Jerome Bonaparte had to bite the bullet and push the door open. When he entered the bedroom, he saw Augusta and Mathilde on the sofa, and Mathilde in his arms. Little guy. Almost instantly, Jerome Bonaparte's eyes were deeply attracted by the little guy, unable to extricate himself. "I have a son. I have a son." Jerome Bonaparte shouted frantically in his heart. At this moment, he felt his connection with the world and was tightly connected by the little guy in his eyes. Just when Jerome Bonaparte fell into the joy of becoming a father, Mathilde's cunning and mean voice reached Jerome Bonaparte's ears once again. "Young, isn't this our emperor, His Majesty? Why did you come back so soon, sister?" Princess Mathilde's sarcasm did not make Jerome Bonaparte feel embarrassed, but made him feel a little moved. The two people sitting in this room are his own in this world. The closest person, Prince Montfort, the irresponsible father, has been automatically acquired by Jerome Bonaparte, is the one who can make himself cry. "Augusta, I'm back," Jerome Bonaparte said softly as he walked in front of Augusta and Mathilde. After hearing what Jerome Bonaparte said, Augusta immediately got up and hugged Jerome Bonaparte and put his head on Jerome Bonaparte's chest. "I used to be resentful and complain about Jerome Bonaparte. Now it's all turned into longing." The corner of Princess Mathilde's mouth also showed a smile. She turned Friedrich's body in the direction of Jerome Bonaparte and said to Crown Prince Friedrich, "Frederick, say welcome back." Frederick just yelled yeah, but he also had a smile on his face. Jerome Bonaparte and Queen Augusta hugged each other for a long time, until Princess Mathilde coughed twice. Queen Augusta and Jerome Bonaparte did not they let go of each other. "Welcome back." Queen Augusta looked at Jerome Bonaparte affectionately and said, Just when Jerome Bonaparte was full of joy and thought that he could get away with it, Queen Augusta and Princess Mathilde immediately changed their attitudes and criticized Jerome Bonaparte. Princess Mathilde said that Jerome Bonaparte was not a responsible father at all and said that if Pope Pius IX hadn't come over, he would definitely not have come back so soon. And Queen Augusta did not say some harsh words like Princess Mathilde, but her eyes full of resentment made Jerome Bonaparte feel a sense of guilt. Jerome Bonaparte, who knew that he was wrong, could only learn from his cousin's way of dealing with Eugenie. He did not justify his actions at all, but tactfully admitted his mistakes and promised that he would not let this sort of thing happen again. Of course, the final guarantee can be said to be fart. How could he, who had tasted the sweetness of prestige through the Crimean War, stay quietly in Paris? As long as there is a large-scale war, he will definitely act with the general staff. Only when he is with the army can he ensure his control over the army. If the general staff makes decisions on the front line instead of him, power will gradually move towards the general staff. This is the case of William II in history, when the last loyal chief of staff, Falkenham, was ousted because of the Verdun meat grinder. Wilhelm II, who had no masters, appointed Hindenburg and Ludendorff. The beginning of his loss of military rights. The emperor must protect the absolute control of the army at all times. Then again, Augusta and Mathilde were equally unconvinced that Jerome Bonaparte would stay safe and motionless in Paris in the few years they spent with Jerome Bonaparte. They had already fully understood Jerome Bonaparte's adventurous character. Hey, when you are going to do this kind of thing in the future, can you tell us completely? Princess Mathilde sighed. You know that Augusta learned that you are going to Crimea. What was your expression like when you were on the peninsula? I don't want to end the battle as soon as possible. Jerome Bonaparte touched his nose and smiled awkwardly. Even so, you shouldn't. Princess Mathilde continued to play Augusta to complain about Jerome Bonaparte. If it wasn't for Duke Galitzin of Petersburg this time, you probably wouldn't have ended it so fast. Sometimes, luck can't stop it. Jerome Bonaparte shrugged his shoulders and said to Mathilde with emotion, however, Duke Galitzin's rebellion did accelerate our final victory. By the way, what are you going to do with the two governments of the Russian Empire? Princess Mathilde asked Jerome Bonaparte again. Sister, why are you asking this? Jerome Bonaparte was stunned, looking at Princess Mathilde suspiciously. Some of my Russian friends are asking me about this. Princess Mathilde said calmly to Jerome Bonaparte. They hope that the French Empire can help the Russian Empire completely destroy the traitors in St. Petersburg. The matter of destroying the traitors in St. Petersburg should be handed over to their Majesty Alexis. Jerome Bonaparte had no interest at all in destroying the new government of Galitzin. He wished that Russia would be smashed into ruins. And are you really going to dismember the Russian Empire? Princess Mathilde asked Jerome Bonaparte again. Dismembered? I didn't dismember. Jerome Bonaparte responded confidently to Mathilde. I just returned Finland to Sweden and made Poland independent again. At the same time, let the Crimea Peninsula return to the Ottomans. You spit out all the efforts of Russia for 100 years at once. Duke Mathilde replied to Jerome Bonaparte. Where is this going? Jerome Bonaparte couldn't help thinking to himself. He was merciful enough compared to the territories lost when the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union collapsed. In the 21st century in which Jerome Bonaparte lived in his previous life, it was the Russian Federation that was truly slashed. The Soviet Empire, which once spanned the entire Eurasian continent, has become a military power that consumes each other with Ukraine. If Peter the Great saw Russia more than 300 years later, I'm afraid he would be off by Russia. At present Russia's main body has not been weakened, and it still has great potential. Jerome Bonaparte replied to Mathilde, as long as Russia can develop quietly after the end of the Civil War, to rise again. Alas. Princess Mathilde sighed at what happened to the Russian Empire. By the way, Augusta, if I remember correctly, the wife of my cheap brother-in-law seems to be the daughter of Tsar Nicholas, right? Jerome Bonaparte suddenly remembered one thing. He hurriedly asked Augusta Road. Queen Augusta nodded. Then did she say anything like that? Jerome Bonaparte asked again. A few days ago, she had an exchange with me when she accompanied my brother to the Tuileries Palace. Queen Augusta replied to Jerome Bonaparte. Later, Queen Augusta told Jerome Bonaparte that his brother and sister-in-law were at the Louvre Hotel. Chapter 732. Check in Holy Land, Paris. The Louvre Hotel? How did you arrange them there? You should let them live at the Tuileries Palace. Jerome Bonaparte criticized Queen Augusta in a slightly reproachful tone. After all, he didn't want to have a bad reputation in the monarchy circle. Brother, he doesn't want to live in the Tuileries Palace. Queen Augusta replied to Jerome Bonaparte, so, I can only arrange them at the Louvre Hotel. After listening to Queen Augusta's words, Jerome Bonaparte's first impression was that his eldest brother wouldn't be smashing his own game for the sake of his wife. However, Jerome Bonaparte thought about it again and felt that it was a little unlikely. His father-in-law should not have done such a brainless thing. His son-in-law did nothing to harm the kingdom of Württemberg. Not only that, after the success of the French Empire in the Crimean War, it also indirectly increased the influence of the Kingdom of Württemberg in southern Germany. As the second largest state in South Germany, Württemberg has now become an existence in South Germany that can fight against the Kingdom of Bavaria. There is no reason for his old father-in-law to let his brother-in-law look at him, unless he wants to completely break with the French Empire. However, after the break, the Kingdom of Württemberg will return to its previous status, and not many people are willing to stare at the premise of being hated by the French Empire and accept the peak at the Kingdom of Württemberg. Alas, Jerome Bonaparte, who had been thinking for a long time, couldn't understand what was going on, so he could only sigh, find a chance to meet them. At this time, neither Jerome Bonaparte nor Augusta realized that the future King Caroli of Württemberg was actually a homosexual. The reason why he was reluctant to live in the Tuileries Palace was also because the life in the Tuileries Palace prevented him from seeking pleasure. During this period, only Bahia could tolerate his homosexual character. Okay. Queen Augusta nodded. Then he told Jerome Bonaparte that a large number of monarchs would come to observe the baptism in a week. Hearing this sentence, Jerome Bonaparte showed a look of resistance on his face. He was planning to take advantage of this time to rest a little, but found that he had to arrange the reception work himself. Alas. Why do you have to get together and come here? Can't wait for a while. Come on, Your Majesty. Princess Mathilde's gloating voice reached Jerome Bonaparte's ear. Speak. Who is coming? Jerome Bonaparte asked Empress Augusta feebly. My sister Katerina, Queen of the Netherlands, Regent of Baden, Frederick Wilhelm Ludwig, former Bavarian King Ludwig Karol August, Crown Prince of Sweden, the Duke of Kona, the Grand Duke Maximilian of the Austrian Empire, the Belgian Crown Prince Leopold. Queen Augusta said to Jerome Bonaparte in turn. There are quite a lot of guests here. Jerome Bonaparte touched his nose again. Queen Augusta's list basically includes most of the countries in Central Europe, Western Europe and Northern Europe. Some of them come to get close to France, some to communicate with France. In short, everyone does not simply want to watch Friedrich's baptism. Okay, I understand. Jerome Bonaparte nodded and replied to Augusta, I will handle it properly. As soon as Jerome Bonaparte finished speaking, there was a crisp knock on the door. Who is it? Jerome Bonaparte hurriedly asked. Your Majesty, the lunch is ready. Mercury outside the door humbly shouted to Jerome Bonaparte and Queen Augusta. Okay, I see. Jerome Bonaparte responded quickly, then turned to Queen Augusta and Princess Mathilde and said, let's go to dinner first, then, let's go. Princess Mathilde got up and handed Frederick over to Jerome Bonaparte. Your child, you better get closer. Small book booth. Jerome Bonaparte hugged Frederick in his arms, looked at his big agile eyes, raised him high and said proudly, my child will definitely become a man in the future. A monarch like me, like you. Princess Mathilde looked at Jerome Bonaparte with disgust. Did you get fat into a ball when you were young? That's all in the past. Jerome Friction responded embarrassingly. He found that his sister was best at revealing shortcoming. However, he still gently reminded Frederick, sure. Don't be too fat. Otherwise, when you lose weight, it will be uncomfortable. Frederick, who was held high by Jerome Bonaparte, laughed again, creeping. Just as Jerome Bonaparte went out with Frederick and Empress Augusta shoulder to shoulder, Empress Augusta said to Jerome Bonaparte in a slightly low tone, don't forget your other child. Only then did Jerome Bonaparte realize that the Marquise of Valais had also given birth, and he hurriedly asked, a boy or a girl? Boy. Queen Augusta replied with a hint of resentment. I Looking at the depressed Augusta, Jerome Bonaparte sighed and said to him, "I'm sorry, Augusta. It's nothing." Queen Augusta shook her head and then replied to Jerome Bonaparte seriously, the Marquis of Alais, is much more difficult than me. After speaking, Augusta left. First point Jerome Bonaparte, who was holding Friedrich in his arms, also left the room with a heavy heart. When Jerome Bonaparte arrived at the restaurant, he immediately handed Frederick in his arms to the professional team, who had been waiting for a long time. Frederick was reluctant to leave the embrace of Jerome Bonaparte, and kept screaming, "Yeah, I'll hug you after daddy has finished eating." Jerome Bonaparte softly comforted Frederick, who was held in his arms by the professional team. The restaurant, where Friedrich left immediately, and Jerome Bonaparte was able to enjoy the food, since none of the three present said a word. The whole lunch took nearly half an hour. After eating lunch, Jerome Bonaparte ran into Augusta's room again, and Frederick had fallen asleep at this time. Looking at Frederick in the cradle, Jerome Bonaparte showed a loving smile on his face. Although he lived to live, this was his first child. In order not to disturb Frederick's rest, Jerome Bonaparte quietly left the room, and then found Mockett in the Tuileries Palace. "You immediately ask the Minister of Justice, Rouet, and the Minister of the Interior, Pesani, to come over," Jerome Bonaparte said solemnly. "Just say that I have something to ask them both, and the place to talk is in the study." "Yes, Your Majesty," Mockett responded to Jerome Bonaparte and left. Jerome Bonaparte went to the study, where he had been away for nearly 4 months by himself. When Jerome Bonaparte arrived in the study, he immediately sat on the chair, then closed his eyes, and waited for the arrival of Rouet and Pesani. After about half an hour, there was a knock on the door, and Jerome Bonaparte opened his eyes and said, "Come in." The door opened, and Mockett, Rouet, and Pesani appeared in front of Jerome Bonaparte. "Your Majesty, Minister Rouet and Minister Pesani are here," Mercury replied to Jerome Bonaparte. "Okay, Mockett, you go out first." Jerome Bonaparte waved his hand and responded to Mockett. After Mockett left, Jerome Bonaparte got up and looked at Rouet and Pesani and said, "Let's sit on the sofa and talk in detail." Rouet and Pesani felt a little uneasy in the hearts of Jerome Bonaparte, who exuded the aura of a military emperor. Although they could roughly guess why Jerome Bonaparte would let them come, but they are still a little scared. Jerome Bonaparte is now more powerful than he was a few months ago. Apart from death, the whole of France is already his opponent. "Yes, Your Majesty." Rouet and Pesani followed Jerome Bonaparte as they sat on the sofa. Jerome Bonaparte, who had just sat down on the sofa, turned to ask Pesani in a friendly tone how he was doing at the Ministry of the Interior. Pesani humbly told Jerome Bonaparte, "He's doing a decent job at the Ministry of the Interior. That's good." Jerome Bonaparte smiled and nodded, then turned to look at Rouet. "Rouet, you've been tired for a while." "Your Majesty, it's nothing." Rouet shook his head and said to Jerome Bonaparte, "By the way, I heard that the Ministry of Justice has exiled a lot of people after I left. Is there such a thing?" Jerome Bonaparte asked Rouet casually again. "Yes, Your Majesty, those are all people who subvert the imperial regime." Rouet responded with a firm attitude. "What are they subverting with?" Jerome Bonaparte asked Rouet again. "Gun or cannon?" "No." Rouet shook his head and replied to Jerome Bonaparte, "They are suspected of spreading pamphlets that defame the empire and defame the Crimean War." "Oh." Jerome Bonaparte responded with a hint of surprise. He really did not expect that there would be people fighting against the war during the war. This was really beyond his expectations. "So you exiled them all?" Chapter 733, Take Back the Spilled Water. "So, you exiled them all?" Jerome Bonaparte's questioning made Rouet feel as if he had screwed up, and he hurriedly explained to Jerome Bonaparte that not was exiled, and most of them were also used by him in debt. Questions are held in debt prisons after all. The literati of this age will more or less owe some debt, and it is reasonable to put them in debt prison. Hey. Jerome Bonaparte sighed slightly. He understood that Rouet's purpose was also to maintain the majesty of the empire in the hearts of citizens. If an empire frightens its people with majesty, it will soon be overthrown. However, Rouet's method was a little too rude. "Your Majesty," Rouet asked Jerome Bonaparte cautiously, "I will release all those imprisoned now. What's the use of going now?" Jerome Bonaparte said sternly, if you do this, you will only make those guys more unscrupulous. Then what should I do? Raoult asked Jerome Bonaparte again. Did those guys in your group expressly oppose the empire before? Jerome Bonaparte asked Raoult. Raoult nodded to Jerome Bonaparte and said, Your Majesty, I can assure you that every one of them has said something against the empire. How many of them oppose this war? Jerome Bonaparte asked Raoult again. Point at this time, Rouet turned his attention to Pessigny, the Minister of the Interior. Although he did the trial, Pessigny had always done the collection of charges. Your Majesty, most of them have opposed war. Pessigny hurriedly said to Jerome Bonaparte, That's easy. Jerome Bonaparte clapped his hands and said to Pessigny and Raoult, You two will send someone to the prison in a while and release all those who are willing to cooperate with us. You can tell them that I don't ask them to be very supportive of the empire, as long as they promise not to oppose the empire. Your Majesty, what about the rest of the people? Rouet then asked. You can collect and post the anticipation speeches of the guys who are unwilling to cooperate in the war and post them all over Paris, and then use public relations to criticize those guys and forge the evidence that they received Russian rubles during the war. Jerome Bonaparte responded confidently to Rouet, Believe me, there will be brave Parisians who will charge for us. At that time, they will either choose to be with us, or they will leave France in ashes. After listening to Jerome Bonaparte's words, Raoult and Pessigny opened their eyes. For the first time, they discovered that they could even use the method of splashing sewage to defeat them. This method is no better than arresting people at will. Jerome Bonaparte warned them, I didn't tell you to make more use of public opinion. Now the entire public opinion in France has been occupied by us, making them disgusting. Fame is not easy. The reason why those public figures have so much power is not because they have been noticed for so long. Once the people who follow them leave them, they will be vulnerable. Have you understood? Raoult and Pessigny nodded at the same time, and then Jerome Bonaparte said to the two of them, Also, you should make more use of the examination system, so as to prevent some thoughts that are harmful to the French people from invading France. In the realm of the human spirit. By the way, Rouet, wait a moment, and send a message to the provinces of the empire on my behalf, ordering them to strictly investigate the tabloids that have not been approved. Jerome Bonaparte clearly remembers that it was precisely because the Second Empire in history neglected to strictly control the local newspapers at the city level that the entire Republican faction took root at the grassroots level and gradually eroded away imperial power. Although the current self has gained more support than his cousin in history, he cannot ignore the surveillance of the Republican faction either. Yes, Your Majesty. Raoult and Pessigny nodded at the same time and replied to Jerome Bonaparte. Point after explaining this, Jerome Bonaparte waved to Raoult and Pessigny, telling them that they could leave, and by the way, asked them to call Mocker again. Raoult and Pessigny hurriedly got up and left, and after a while, Mocker appeared in front of Jerome Bonaparte. You have to run again and call the Chancellor of the Exchequer Magnate and the President of the Bank of France, Bimini. Jerome Bonaparte immediately gave an order to Mocker. After receiving the order, Mocker quickly left Jerome Bonaparte's office, while Jerome Bonaparte, who was slightly tired, lay on the sofa and closed his eyes. Your Majesty, Your Majesty. I don't know how long it took. The bursts of calls from his ears woke Jerome Bonaparte from his deep sleep. After opening his eyes, he saw Manet and Bimini. Let's make you laugh. Jerome Bonaparte hurriedly took his feet off the sofa, with an embarrassed yet polite smile on his face. Your Majesty, we have just arrived. Manet hurriedly left a step for Jerome Bonaparte. Stop. Standing. Sit. Jerome Bonaparte stretched out his hand to invite Magnate and Bimini to sit down, and then ordered Mocker, bring me 3 cups of coffee, one with the other 2 cups. Jerome Bonaparte looked at Manet and Bimini, and Manet and Bimini said that their cup was also sweet. And point after Mocker left, Jerome Bonaparte immediately asked Magnate about the financial income and expenditure of the French Empire in the last year. Magnate told Jerome Bonaparte that the fiscal revenue of the French Empire last year was about 268.560000, 2.6856 billion francs, while the annual expenditure was 298.750000, 2.9875 billion francs, and the fiscal deficit was 300 million francs. Among them, the largest project last year was the military, which accounted for about 850 million francs in total. How come there are so many? Jerome Bonaparte couldn't help, but asked man at point. He clearly remembered that he only wanted the Legislative Council to propose a military expenditure of 300 million francs, and it is reasonable to say that it would be around 600 million francs at most. Your Majesty, we were surprised when we got this data. Magnate replied to Jerome Bonaparte with a wry smile, and then said with emotion to Jerome Bonaparte, thanks to this the war lasted only a year, otherwise. Then, Jerome Bonaparte turned his attention to Bimini and said, how many small banknotes has the Banque de France issued so far? Your Majesty, so far, we have issued banknotes worth nearly 1 billion. Bimini also replied to Jerome Bonaparte, is there any problem in the middle? Jerome Bonaparte then asked Beethoven. So far there is no problem. Bimini shook his head and replied to Jerome Bonaparte, if I wanted to forge your banknotes, wouldn't it be difficult? Jerome Bonaparte immediately asked Bimini, remembering the words of the old man on the train. This time, Bimini's attitude was not as decisive as last time. After hesitating for a while, he replied to Jerome Bonaparte that they were all banknotes printed with a special watermark, so there should be no such thing happening point, and there is a high probability that no one will imitate those banknotes with a face value of only about 5 or 10 francs. That's it. Jerome Bonaparte thought for a moment and then ordered Biminis to closely monitor the issuance of French banknotes and at the same time to supervise banks that hold a large number of French banknotes to prevent them from maliciously selling banknotes, thereby causing a crisis. Is there any problem with our banknotes? Bimini asked nervously. He didn't want to fall for the banknote issue. No. Jerome Bonaparte shook his head and replied to Bimini in a daze. You just need to say something to the board members of the French banknote. I will tell them your words. Bimini replied to Jerome Bonaparte. Right. One more thing. Isn't the war over now? We should also consider taking back some of the water that was thrown out. Jerome Bonaparte then said to Bimini. Hearing Jerome Bonaparte's words, a smile appeared on Bimini's face. During this period, the reserves that the Banque de France scatters to stabilize the market have reached the point where Bimini feels an easy point. If it wasn't for the fact that Duke Galitzin had recently transported the assets of the Russian Empire to buy rifles used in the Civil War, the Banque de France would have really considered selling a batch of English government bonds at a low price to stabilize the market point. Well, now the war is over and they don't have to subsidize the imperial industry anymore. However, Jerome Bonaparte's next sentence knocked the poor banker from heaven to the world. This withdrawal cannot be withdrawn at once. We must subsidize them for a while. Yes. Bimini had to obey Jerome Bonaparte's arrangement and replied. Tell those shareholders that I have helped them find a suitable harvesting place. Now ask them to bleed again to maintain the current prosperity of the empire. Jerome Bonaparte combined the indemnity that Alexander II had promised him with the mine mortgage. Told Bimini. A smile appeared on Bimini's face again. For French capital, the Russian Empire is simply a natural treasure country. Now that the entire treasury has been opened to them under the leadership of the emperor, how could they not be moved? Chapter 734, Ambition of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Bimini quickly made it clear to Jerome Bonaparte that he would surely persuade the board members of the Banque de France to continue to contribute to the prosperity of the empire. That's good. Jerome Bonaparte stretched his arms while yawning. That's all I want to say. I just don't know if you two have anything else to add. Bimini and Maini shook their heads, indicating that they had nothing else to add. Then, let's do it first, said Jerome Bonaparte politely to Bimini and Magnate. Bimini and Magnate immediately got up and bowed to Jerome Bonaparte before leaving. Shortly after Bimini and Magnate left, Jerome Bonaparte also got up and went to Queen Augusta's bedroom to communicate with his son Friedrich. Book time passed minute by minute, and soon night fell. Candles were lit in the corridors and rooms of the Tuileries Palace. The Tuileries Palace under the light of candles and golden utensils looked extraordinarily graceful and luxurious at this time. Jerome Bonaparte was sitting in a room, while slowly placing Frederick on the carpeted floor with his hands, while listening quietly to the National Intelligence Service sitting opposite him. Dean Marcel Yalager's return. After Marcel Yalager finished talking about all the domestic issues, Jerome Bonaparte nodded and asked, him about the Russian Empire. Is Duke Galitzin still in touch with you? Marcel Yeroja shook his head and replied to Jerome Bonaparte. The Duke of Galitzin not only stopped contacting us, but also dispatched the 3rd Department to clear our hidden lines in St. Petersburg. Now the forces we have developed in St. Petersburg have been destroyed by Duke Galitzin's unrelenting blow. Only a handful of people escaped this sweep. As soon as Marcel Yeroja finished speaking, Jerome Bonaparte sighed and said to Marcel Yeroja, alas, Duke Galitzin seems to be wary of us. Marcel Yeroja remained silent, and Jerome Bonaparte continued to ask, by the way, can you now rebuild the organization that has collapsed in the Russian Empire? Your Majesty, it may be difficult in a short period of time. Marcel Yeroja replied, I think the reason why their power in the Russian Empire was able to develop rapidly at the beginning was all due to the cooperation of Duke Galitzin and the others. A former anti-thief has now been turned into a regular, and they naturally need to find a collaborator again. But collaborators, how can it be so easy to succeed? What's more, the person they have to face is Duke Galitzin, who once escaped the official pursuit of the Russian Empire as a rebel. After any anti-thief in history has become a regular army, he will subconsciously prevent future people from going back to their own path and overthrowing them. Therefore, Duke Galitzin is more difficult than the Tsarist government, and it is very difficult to develop suitable people under the eyes of Duke Galitzin. Then, don't worry, Jerome Bonaparte said to Marcel Yeroja. Just as Jerome Bonaparte was about to ask Marcel Yeroja other questions, the voice of Yer came from his ear. Jerome Bonaparte had no choice but to take Friedrich in his arms again. He seemed to have forgotten that Friedrich was less than a month old, shaking his hand gently as a cradle. Go and find out for me one person, Your Majesty. Who? Marcel Yeroja immediately asked Jerome Bonaparte. That's the guy I met on the train, and I don't know his name, but I'm sure that guy must have been a famous guy in Orleans and they should be familiar with Mignatin Thiers. Jerome Bonaparte stated his impressions of the old man in turn. By the way, Minister Walewski seems to be talking to the old man somewhere. Have met. You can go and question him carefully. Your Majesty, do you need me to use a prop? Marcel Yeroja asked Jerome Bonaparte politely. Jerome Bonaparte chuckled lightly and replied to Marcel Yeroja, no need. Just let him think about where he met before. Okay. Marcel Yeroja nodded and replied a word to Jerome Bonaparte. By the way, you have to find this person as soon as possible. Jerome Bonaparte ordered again. After finding it, what should I do? Marcel Yeroja continued to ask. Monitor him closely first to see who he is in close contact with. Jerome Bonaparte said, remember not to disturb him, and don't follow him deliberately. Clear. In the next few days, Jerome Bonaparte methodically accepted the work at hand from Augusta and Princess Mathilde, while preparing for the baptism. That is to say, in the past few days, Queen Katerina of the Netherlands, Crown Prince Leopold of Belgium, Maximilian of the Austrian Empire, former King Louis of Bavaria, and others arrived at the Tuileries Palace in turn. Jerome Bonaparte. They were arranged in different residences with Princess Augusta according to their closeness. For example, Katerina of the Kingdom of the Netherlands was arranged to live with Queen Augusta, and the Crown Prince of Sweden, the Duke of Carnatha, and others were also arranged in the Tuileries Palace and the Louvre. The Belgian Crown Prince, the future chopping party Leopold II and the former King of Bavaria were arranged at the Louvre Hotel. The arranged Jerome Bonaparte first met with Queen Katerina of the Netherlands in Queen Augusta's bedroom. At this time, Queen Katerina was holding Friedrich and talking with Augusta with a smile on her face. The appearance of Jerome Bonaparte made Katerina turn her attention to him. She glanced at Jerome Bonaparte first, then at Frederick Bonaparte, and nodded. You father and son are so similar, not like me. Is it like the old king next door? Jerome Bonaparte couldn't help but complain in his heart, but he still praised Queen Katerina with a smile on his face. Cousin, you have such a good eye. After greeting each other for a while, Jerome Bonaparte and Queen Katerina officially entered the topic. Queen Katerina first apologized for her husband's failure to come, and praised Jerome Bonaparte as a man who was no less than Emperor Napoleon. Jerome Bonaparte humbly told Queen Katerina that he was still far from Emperor Napoleon. Queen Katerina went on to say that, in her opinion, Jerome Bonaparte was only close to the former Emperor Napoleon, who who was only about to expand his territory. Jerome Bonaparte followed Queen Katerina's train of thought and sighed at the same time, where is the opportunity to expand in Europe now? Many countries have always been very wary of France. The last time Luxembourg was, if it were not for the fact that the French army had been stationed in the Principality of Luxembourg, it would have been difficult for them to take Luxembourg, even if they signed an agreement with the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Therefore, he was very grateful to Queen Katerina and King William for taking care of them, and he assured Queen Katerina that, as long as the French Empire remained in Europe, he would not let anyone harm the Kingdom of the Netherlands. After Katerina heard Jerome Bonaparte's assurance, she was like a reassurance pill. She believed that Jerome Bonaparte would not betray her faith on this issue. Therefore, Queen Katerina boldly told Jerome Bonaparte that the territories that had been demarcated by European countries could not be moved, but some territories with disputes were good excuses. If France is willing to help the country in the disputed territory to do justice, then the country that gets justice will give France what it believes in. Cousin, what do you mean by this sentence? Why can't I understand it? Jerome Bonaparte asked Queen Katerina, pretending to be indifferent. I mean, we have some disputes with the Kingdom of Belgium. Queen Katerina simply said, so, I think Lancy can help us with this issue. Cousin, haven't you already announced your abandonment of the Kingdom of Belgium? Jerome Bonaparte asked with a puzzled expression on his face. Although the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the Kingdom of Belgium were indeed one country before, the two were separated more than 20 years ago in 1830. And in 1839 the Kingdom of the Netherlands also recognized the independence of the Kingdom of Belgium. The assistance of the Kingdom of Orleans is of great importance. Is it a bit too unkind to not recognize the independence of the Kingdom of Belgium today? If you give up, you can't get it back again. Queen Katerina confidently said to Jerome Bonaparte, the land in Belgium was originally obtained through territorial replacement. Why do they say that independence means nothing? Independent, although Queen Katerina's words sounded a bit unreasonable at first, but in retrospect, it did make sense. Although the independence of the Kingdom of Belgium was caused by the oppression of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the subsequent independence movement was completed by some regular French troops under the banner of the Volunteer Army. Father of Belgium, if the Kingdom of Orleans still existed, Jerome Bonaparte's brother-in-law, William, could only swallow his voice, and the entire Dutch government would not dare to have any thoughts about Belgium. Now the Kingdom of Orleans is gone, replaced by the Second Empire that is close to them. The idea of reconquering Belgium became hot in the Netherlands. Cousin. No, His Majesty Emperor Jerome Bonaparte. Queen Katerina rubbed against Jerome with her honorary title. It's all in the same family. You should call me cousin. Jerome Bonaparte hurriedly said to Katerina, cousin, you don't want to see the remnants of the Orleans family occupy the position of the Belgian kingdom. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 735, Polish Consensus. Cousin, you don't want to see the remnants of the Orleans family continue to control the Kingdom of Belgium. Queen Katerina's words caused Jerome Bonaparte to doubt whether he had crossed into an indescribable world. This day, Jerome Bonaparte paused for a while and quickly changed his tune. Cousin, I think it's a little bad for the two of us to discuss dividing up a country so blatantly here. Although the Kingdom of Belgium did belong to you before, they have really become an independent and sovereign country. At any rate, we should also consider international issues. Cousin. Queen Katerina obviously didn't care about the so-called international reaction. He bluntly said to Jerome Bonaparte, now which country in Europe dares not obey your orders? What are you afraid of? Before I came, William, King of the Netherlands, told me that we don't need your troops to help us. As long as you can, when we send troops, stand on our side. But, Jerome Bonaparte said evasively, cousin, you should understand. The original Belgian kingdom was successfully built with the help of France. So France's feelings for the Kingdom of Belgium are much more complicated than you might imagine. Queen Katerina reassured Jerome Bonaparte, this is not easy. After our army has completely occupied the Kingdom of Belgium, we will hand over the province of Luxembourg to you. In this case, the area of the Principality of Luxembourg will be 100%. It can be doubled out of thin air. This after hearing Queen Katerina's assurance, Jerome Bonaparte felt a tinge in his heart. As my cousin said, the friendship between the French Empire and the Kingdom of Belgium is far less than that of the Kingdom of Orleans. Jerome Bonaparte was not obliged to protect them like the Kingdom of Orleans at the time. Instead, it was more in the interest of the Netherlands to support the annexation of the Kingdom of Belgium. Don't look at the fact that the Kingdom of Belgium has sent its own crown prince. In fact, it is just a form. Think about it. Jerome Bonaparte finally replied, anyway, cousin, you are not in a hurry. Alright then. Although Queen Katerina felt a little unwilling, she still chose to give Jerome Bonaparte some time for him to think about it. Immediately afterwards, Jerome Bonaparte left Queen Augusta's room on the pretext of handling government affairs. He was afraid that his cousin would cause her a lot of complicated problems if things went on like this. Jerome Bonaparte, who was walking in the corridor, thought for a moment, then decided to go to the Dock d'Orsage to ask Walewski's opinion. So, I walked downstairs quickly to the hall of the Tuileries Palace. Mocker in the hall hurried to Jerome Bonaparte's side and asked Jerome Bonaparte what instructions he had. You will prepare a carriage for me immediately, and I will go to the Orsay Pier in person. Jerome Bonaparte said succinctly, yes, your majesty. Mocker bowed slightly and turned to leave. Before Mocker disappeared in the corridor, Jerome Bonaparte called Mocker again. When Mocker turned to ask what other instructions Jerome Bonaparte had, Jerome Bonaparte replied, and help me prepare a wig and glasses in advance. Try to choose a simpler carriage, don't be like this. The bells and whistles, and, this time, no one needs to follow. I understand. Mocker nodded and disappeared into the corridor on the right side of the hall. About 10 minutes later, Mocker appeared and replied to Jerome Bonaparte, Your Majesty, everything has been prepared for you. That's good. Jerome Bonaparte nodded, and then asked again, That's right. If Queen Katerina asks me, tell her, I'm already thinking about what she said. Yes. Mercury replied, bowing to Jerome Bonaparte. Afterwards, Jerome Bonaparte left the Tuileries Palace alone and took a simple black carriage to the Orsay Pier. The carriage rushed out of the gardens of the Tuileries Palace, along the Champs-Élysées to the banks of the Seine, and then along the banks of the Seine all the way east to the vicinity of the Arrangement Pier. When Jerome Bonaparte entered the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a clerk stopped Jerome Bonaparte's way. Who are you? What are you doing here? The clerk asked suspiciously, looking at Jerome Bonaparte, who was wearing a wig and glasses. Take me to your foreign minister. Jerome Bonaparte gave the order to the clerk in a low voice, pretending to be hoarse. Not recognizing the clerk in disguise of Jerome Bonaparte at all, he glanced up and down at Jerome Bonaparte, and then asked with a hint of arrogance, Do you have an appointment? If you do, Minister Walewski will not meet you. I don't have an appointment. Jerome Bonaparte shook his head as he methodically took off his glasses and wig. I don't know. Can I meet your minister like this? The clerk's expression became more and more frightened as Jerome Bonaparte gradually removed his disguise. I'm afraid he would never have imagined that the dignified emperor of the French Empire would one day choose to visit privately in casual clothes. The clerk's face showed an embarrassed expression, and he hesitantly said to Jerome Bonaparte, Your Majesty, of course you can. You can come anytime, anywhere, ha ha ha. Jerome Bonaparte smiled slightly, then patted the clerk on the shoulder and said, Don't be nervous, I'm not a man-eating monster. Yes. The clerk could only answer in a submissive manner. Let's go. Take me to see your minister. Jerome Bonaparte motioned for the clerk to lead the way. The clerk led Jerome Bonaparte up the stairs, and when they reached the corner between the second and third floors, the Secretary of State for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs appeared in the corridor. He glanced first at the clerk, then at Jerome Bonaparte, and then bowed to Jerome Bonaparte. Exactly, you take me to see Walewski. Jerome Bonaparte, who saw the Secretary of State, said with a smile, then patted the clerk on the shoulder lightly. Thank you for your hard work. It's gone. It's not hard. It's not hard. The clerk shook his head and replied to Jerome Bonaparte. Afterwards, the Secretary of State and Jerome Bonaparte continued to walk up and when they reached the floor where Walewski's office was located, the Secretary of State told Jerome Bonaparte that Minister Walewski was having a conversation with someone. Who? Jerome Bonaparte asked curiously. Count Bauer, Austrian Foreign Minister. The State Secretary replied decisively. Bauer? When did he come here? Jerome Bonaparte was stunned for a few seconds, then asked. Count Bauer has been in Paris for more than a week. The Secretary of State responded immediately. Jerome Bonaparte frowned slightly. 4 days had passed since he arrived in Paris, and no one had told him about the arrival of the Count of Bauer. Actually, Queen Augusta said it once, but Jerome Bonaparte was too tired to handle domestic affairs, so he forgot about it in a blink of an eye. Do you know what the conversation between Count Bauer and Walewski was about? Jerome Bonaparte asked the Secretary of State again. It seems to be a Polish problem. The State Secretary replied, Your Majesty, I don't know the specific situation. They just talked. Then what did you do when you came downstairs? Said Jerome Bonaparte to the Secretary of State. Ah. The Secretary of State finally reacted. He seemed to have forgotten his business. Minister Walewski just asked me to prepare 2 cups of black tea for him. Jerome Bonaparte shook his head and then responded to the Secretary of State. Make 3 cups of black tea right away. Forget it, you better make a pot of tea. Your Majesty, do you want to go in too? The State Secretary asked subconsciously. That's right. Let's go. Jerome Bonaparte said, and immediately came to the gate of Walewski's office, and then gently pushed Walewski's office away. Why are you like this? Walewski's reprimand came from the room first, followed by the surprised voices of Earl Bauer and Walewski. Your Majesty, Monsieur Bauer. Jerome Bonaparte closed the door softly and nodded to him with a smile. Count Bauer and Walewski hurriedly stood up to salute Jerome Bonaparte and offered their seats for Jerome Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte was sitting slowly behind the main seat of the sofa and invited Count Bauer and Walewski to sit down, and they both sat down separately. I'm here uninvited. Jerome Bonaparte stated at the very beginning that he came here as an emergency. I didn't expect that, Walewski, and you were still talking before I came. Your Majesty, Minister Walewski and his ministers are discussing the issue of Poland. Count Bauer hurriedly explained to Jerome Bonaparte. Yeah, Your Majesty. Walewski nodded and said to Jerome Bonaparte, I was going to hand it over to you after discussing the results. Discuss? What to discuss? Jerome Bonaparte looked at Count Bauer suspiciously. Could it be that Maximilian is unwilling to be the Grand Duke of Warsaw? No. The Count of Bauer shook his head and replied to Jerome Bonaparte. Franz Joseph is preparing to canonize Maximilian as the Grand Duke of Krakow and Galicia, and he specially ordered him to come and ask Jerome Bonaparte. Bonaparte's opinion. Chapter 736. Banging Leopold. After Count Bauer finished speaking, the entire room fell into silence. After a while, Jerome Bonaparte, who had reacted, immediately spoke. The Grand Duke of Krakow Galicia? Franz Joseph is preparing to reunite Poland, which was occupied by the Austrian Empire, and the Grand Duchy of Poland. That's right. Earl Bauer nodded and said, Our Emperor hopes to have your support. Support? Of course I support it. Jerome Bonaparte replied with a smile. The Prussian side. Count Bauer, who received an accurate answer from Jerome Bonaparte, asked tentatively. Don't worry. Jerome Bonaparte hurriedly assured Count Bauer, it's not only me who will support you in this matter, but Palmerston and the others will also support your decision. Your Majesty, thank you for what you have done for the Austrian Empire. Count Bauer sincerely thanked. I can assure you that the Austrian Empire will be your most loyal partner. Mr. Bauer, I'm relieved with your words. Jerome Bonaparte silently reservedly, and then continued, the French Empire and the Austrian Empire are a pair of natural allies. Because our two countries are a pair of natural allies. On many issues, there is a common goal. For example, the Russian issue, the German issue, and the Apennine issue. If our two countries are hostile to each other, it will only benefit the third party. However, our French Empire can still be in an isolated environment. Your country may not be sure. Jerome Bonaparte's beating speech made Count Bauer feel a little depressed. However, he still admitted in his heart what Jerome Bonaparte said. The current Austrian Empire really does not have many retreats. offending Prussia and Russia. If they don't hold on to France, Austria will probably become a European outcast like the Russian Empire. You're right. France and Austria should support and help each other. Count Bauer nodded in agreement. No one or any organization can dismantle our union. Jerome Bonaparte clapped his hands and said, Monsieur Bauer, you are absolutely right. Afterwards, Jerome Bonaparte asked Count Bauer when the Grand Duke Maximilian would arrive, so that he could receive the future King of Poland ceremoniously. The Count of Bauer told Jerome Bonaparte that he had received a telegram from Austria, and that Grand Duke Maximilian would accompany Pope Pius IX to Paris. Then, I'll wait and see. Jerome Bonaparte replied with a smile. After the brief but significant diplomatic talks ended, Jerome Bonaparte, Walewski and the Count of Bauer began to enjoy the afternoon tea time quietly. An hour later, when the afternoon tea was over, Count Bauer told Jerome Bonaparte and Walewski that he must do it. I'll give you one, said Jerome Bonaparte politely. No need, Your Majesty. I can go back to the embassy myself. Count Bauer kindly replied to Jerome Bonaparte. Okay then. Jerome Bonaparte shrugged and watched Count Bauer leave the office. After Count Bauer left, Jerome Bonaparte said to Walewski, let's start the next round. Walewski hurriedly invited Jerome Bonaparte to sit down, and then sat opposite him with a serious face. That's right. My cousin, Queen Katerina of the Netherlands. Jerome Bonaparte told Walewski about the division of the Belgian kingdom in a homely tone. Do you think this is it good or bad for the French Empire? Walewski lowered his head and pondered for a moment, then raised his head again and said to Jerome Bonaparte, Your Majesty, the area promised by Her Royal Highness Queen Katerina is the province of Luxembourg in the Kingdom of Belgium. Right. That's right. Jerome Bonaparte replied affirmatively. My cousin means that after the Kingdom of the Netherlands occupied the Kingdom of Belgium, they will immediately hand over the province of Luxembourg to us. Your Majesty. Walewski clenched his fists and said to Jerome Bonaparte with determination, I don't think we should agree to Her Majesty Queen Katerina's request. Jerome Bonaparte's face showed a slight astonishment. He originally thought that Walewski would be inclined to support the Netherlands' return to Belgium. Why? Your Majesty, my point of view is based on 3 points. Walewski analyzed in an orderly manner. The first is that more than 20 years have passed since Belgium became independent, and 20 years have already passed. Enough for the growth of a generation. The previous generation may not have had the idea of the Kingdom of Belgium, but this generation has shaped it. If the Kingdom of the Netherlands wants to return to the Kingdom of Belgium, I'm afraid that it will not only defeat the army of the Kingdom of Belgium, but also gain the support of this generation, which is too difficult for the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Speaking of this, Walewski paused, swallowed his saliva, and continued. The second point is that the older generation of the Kingdom of Belgium still has the memory of the violent expropriation of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. If the Netherlands really wants to attack, those old people will probably become their hindrance. The third and most important point, Walewski asked Jerome Bonaparte with a solemn expression. Your Majesty, what is the purpose of your Crimean War? The purpose of destroying the Russian Empire is of course to tear down the shackles of the Holy Alliance that restrict us. Jerome Bonaparte responded without hesitation. I haven't told you this many times. Then, Your Majesty, have we torn them up? Walewski then asked. After thinking for a while, Jerome Bonaparte said, it's shredded, but is it completely shredded? We just shredded a corner of the Holy Alliance, the Russian Empire, and then replaced the Russian Empire. Indeed, whatever the new order in Jerome Bonaparte's mouth, what he is doing now is a replica of Prince Metternich's European balance of power. So, Your Majesty, since we have become the framers of the new order, we should do our best to maintain the existing order, instead of destroying it like before. Walewski said bitterly to Jerome Bonaparte said. You are right. Jerome Bonaparte suddenly realized. He patted his thigh and said to Walewski, we are the makers of the European order, and we should no longer do this with the idea of destroyer's game. There was a smile on Walewski's face, and he was glad that Jerome Bonaparte could follow his advice. However, are we going to do something too? Jerome Bonaparte recalled a certain alliance in later generations. Iffy, Your Majesty, what are you doing? Walewski looked at Jerome Bonaparte suspiciously. Isn't Leopold at the Grand Hotel Luxembourg? I think it's time to give them some warning. Jerome Bonaparte ordered Walewski, wait a while, and go to Leopold yourself. At the Louvre Hotel, tell Leopold that I have something to look for. Tell him to go to the Élysée Palace to meet me. Yes. Walewski immediately responded to Jerome Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte, who had explained everything, stood up from the sofa, tidied up his sleeve slightly, and replied to Walewski, okay. I'll go to the Élysée Palace to prepare. After speaking, Jerome Bonaparte put on his wig and glasses again under the surprised gaze of Walewski and quickly finished his casual clothes. Fairy would Jerome Bonaparte, who left the Orsay Pier, ordered the carriage to take him to the Élysée Palace. The carriage galloped all the way and soon arrived at the gate of the Élysée Palace. The soldiers in charge of guarding the Élysée Palace stopped Jerome Bonaparte. After seeing him after Jerome Bonaparte took off his wig and glasses, the soldiers saluted Jerome Bonaparte. Reading www.urkanshu.com. Wait a while, a carriage will arrive at the Élysée Palace. Then you can rest assured. Jerome Bonaparte said to the soldiers. Yes. The soldier answered in an angry voice. Jerome Bonaparte, who entered the Élysée Palace, entered a parlor under the leadership of the maid who stayed at the Élysée Palace. Jerome Bonaparte also told the maid to bring him directly. If anyone came over, come to him. The maid led the way away like the soldier, and Jerome Bonaparte was alone now by the window, quietly gazing at the slowly falling sunset in the distance. Half an hour later, when the setting sun gradually disappeared behind the row upon row of buildings, the servants placed the candles and kerosene lamps that had been prepared in the living room. Your Majesty, do you want to eat a little something? The servant asked with concern. No need, said Jerome Bonaparte, shaking his head. The servants left again. 10 minutes later, the door of the living room opened again, and this time it was the Belgian Crown Prince Leopold, also known as the future famous hands-off party Leopold II. During his administration, the chopping party and the entire Congolese colony can be said to occupy half of the colony's population, which is very rare in the entire colonial history. It is rude to say that the atrocities of France in Algeria are not as good as him, and only the Kingdom of Great Britain can rival and surpass him. After all, the Kingdom of Great Britain has not only suffered many famines in India. Even Ireland, which is white, also deliberately created a terrible famine. However, the British Empire with its solid strength makes people there not have any objection. Chapter 737. Preliminary discussion on currency union. Your Majesty, Your Majesty, the Belgian Crown Prince Leopold, who was standing at the door of the room, shouted to Jerome Bonaparte in the room with a worried expression. At this time, he did not know that Jerome Bonaparte sent Walewski. What was the intention of the minister? To invite him here alone. Jerome Bonaparte, who stood with his hands behind his back, hurriedly turned around and carefully looked at the Belgian Crown Prince. He is much younger than the one in the photos of later generations. Leopold II, who was carefully scrutinized by Jerome Bonaparte, became even more uneasy. He had heard such a gossip before he came. According to the grapevine, what the French Emperor Jerome Bonaparte liked most was to call the ambassadors of various countries in front of them individually and have secret conversations with them to discuss political issues. Now, when Emperor Jerome Bonaparte sees him here, is he also discussing some political issues with him? Just when Leopold was thinking about it, Jerome Bonaparte slowly said to him, Leopold, please sit down. Yes. Leopold thanked Jerome Bonaparte and sat down on a chair in the parlor. Jerome Bonaparte also took advantage of the opportunity to sit beside Crown Prince Leopold. Immediately afterwards, Jerome Bonaparte began a chat with Crown Prince Leopold. He first inquired about the physical condition of the Belgian king, and then inquired about the domestic situation in the Kingdom of Belgium. Leopold answered all the questions raised by Jerome Bonaparte seriously. When the chat between the two was getting better, Jerome Bonaparte suddenly changed the conversation and asked Leopold sternly. Special said, Leopold, I heard that Belgium has been secretly supporting the Orleans family living in Britain and giving them a certain amount of funds every year. I don't know if there is such a thing. Leopold, who was no longer nervous in his heart, was instantly shocked when he heard Jerome Bonaparte talking about the news. He didn't know what channel Jerome Bonaparte used. learn about their sponsorship of the Orleans family point. But if you can't explain it clearly, the relationship between the French Empire and the Kingdom of Belgium may plummet. Point. The stable life of the Kingdom of Belgium is inseparable from the help of the Kingdom of Great Britain and France. Point. Once one of these two countries is hostile to them, then there is a high possibility that there will be major unrest in the Kingdom of Belgium. Point. From the early days of its establishment, the Belgian government has not lacked political parties close to France at all. Mainly, there are more French-speaking areas, so they are naturally close to France. Not to mention, the prestige of the French Empire is now stronger than that of the Kingdom of Orleans. This has also led to some originally neutral politicians gradually entering the ranks of pro-France. Your Majesty, who did you listen to? Leopold suppressed the fear in his heart and tried to respond to Jerome Bonaparte in a calm tone. Leopold, you don't need to care who I hear. Jerome Bonaparte responded unceremoniously to Leopold. I just want to ask whether this is true or false. Of what exactly should I do? Leopold roared with filial piety in his heart. He didn't know how much inside information Jerome Bonaparte had and whether he should be honest with Jerome Bonaparte. Mr. Leopold. Jerome Bonaparte decided to put pressure on him to the limit. He asked word by word, I ask you whether this is true or false. Your Majesty, this matter. Leopold took a deep breath, calmed down his messy mood, and said, there is indeed this matter. Then, before Jerome Bonaparte could say the next sentence, Leopold continued, however, we didn't give them too much money. How much is not too much? Jerome Bonaparte asked again, as if he had broken the casserole, and asked to the end. The Orleans family is given 100,000 francs every year. Leopold replied to Jerome Bonaparte. The money was originally paid by my mother. I don't remember Queen Louise already. Jerome Bonaparte hesitated. A look of sadness appeared on Leopold II's face. Although my mother has passed away, the money has not stopped this time. That's it. Jerome Bonaparte softened his attitude a little and then responded to Crown Prince Leopold with a smile. Leopold, thank you for your frankness. Your Majesty, after I return to Belgium, I will tell my father to stop supporting the Orleans family. Leopold II hurriedly expressed his attitude to Jerome Bonaparte. Point. Although the Belgian government is indeed established with the help of the Orleans family, and the Queen of Belgium is also a member of the Orleans family, the kindness between the royal family and the royal family must give way to the interests of the country and the country. Point. The kindness of the Orleans family towards them is nothing compared to the likes and dislikes of the French Empire towards them. Point. What's more, the mother who maintained their relationship with the Orleans family had died in 1850. Stop funding? No need. Jerome Bonaparte shook his head and said to Leopold II, you can continue to support them. Hearing Jerome Bonaparte's words, Leopold was a little confused for a while, but now he can't understand what Jerome Bonaparte wants to do. Could it be that he simply wanted to use this to put pressure on us? Leopold thought to himself. By the way, you can also bring a word to the Orleans family for me. Jerome Bonaparte then said to Leopold, who was distracted. Your Majesty, please speak. Leopold, who had reacted, hurriedly said to Jerome Bonaparte, tell them for me. Jerome Bonaparte said slowly to Leopold II, if they are willing to renounce France, then I can give them 500,000 francs of compensation every year on behalf of the government. Although Jerome Bonaparte himself does not believe that the Orleans family will openly renounce the claim to the French throne for the annual 500,000 francs. After all, the House of Orleans voted with their own hands for the throne, to have a king beheaded, Louis XVI, and then ousted another, Charles X. It can be said that every member of the Orleans family has the orthodox Bourbon hostile buff. Point. If you give up now, it means that the efforts of the previous 2 or even 3 generations of the Orleans family will be in vain in an instant. Point. The whole Orleanite will also suffer a devastating blow, because Orleans relinquishes the throne. But Jerome Bonaparte just wanted to simply disgust the Orleans family. Back then, when the Orleans family was in power, there was a lot of disgust with the Bonaparte family. As soon as Jerome Bonaparte's voice fell, Leopold II immediately replied to Jerome Bonaparte, Your Majesty, I will bring your words to the Orleans family. That's good. Jerome Bonaparte had a satisfied smile on his face, and he enjoyed the sense of accomplishment that drove his prince to do things for himself. Immediately afterwards, Jerome Bonaparte continued to talk to Leopold about his dream of the United Europa. Leopold II turned into a devoted listener to praise Jerome Bonaparte's idea of the United States of Europe. Your Majesty, I believe that sooner or later the European monarchies will be able to unite and form a big alliance. Leopold II said to Jerome Bonaparte, I'm really glad that you can think so. Jerome Bonaparte said to Leopold II in an old-fashioned tone, so, I think we should do something for this envisaged alliance. Hearing this, Leopold's expression was a little embarrassing. He thought that Jerome Bonaparte was just bragging. Who would have thought that Jerome Bonaparte was about to implement it? Your Majesty, where are you going to start? Leopold asked Jerome Bonaparte. Leopold, don't you think that there are too many and too complicated currencies in the whole of Europe, and you reading www.urkanshu.com is not conducive to circulation and trade? Jerome Bonaparte spoke to Lee in a pitying tone. Bonaparte II said something. Indeed. Leopold II nodded and replied to Jerome Bonaparte, so, I want to unite all countries to formulate a new set of currencies which will be circulated in various countries to stabilize currencies and trade. Jerome Bonaparte said to Leopold II his ambition was to build a shrunken version of the euro in 19th century Europe. After listening to Jerome Bonaparte's speech, Leopold II, who was sitting beside Jerome Bonaparte, was also a little moved. Although the Kingdom of Belgium was the first country to complete its industrialization, their market and population severely limited their own ceilings in order to break through this upper limit. The Kingdom of Belgium has thought of all possible ways. The period of the Kingdom of Orleans was their closest time. At that time, Kizzo, the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Marshal Sert, did not care about anything. The foreign minister of the entire cabinet had a lot of foreign affairs and interior affairs, proposed to follow the example of the German customs union at that time. Customs union between France and Belgium. This action was immediately strongly endorsed by Belgian industry and commerce, because once the Franco-Belgian customs union was implemented, they would be able to complement France through this union, thereby raising their ceiling. Who knew that Palmerston, who was then the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Great Britain, was firmly opposed to the customs union of France and Belgium, and that the foreign minister named by Louis-Philippe, Kizzo, was different from fierce tough man. He was a British minister who advocated a right compromise. It led to the death of the French-Belgian customs union in the womb. Today, the currency union proposed by Jerome Bonaparte is far inferior to the customs union, but it can also bring benefits to the Kingdom of Belgium. Chapter 738, Europa League. Leopold II immediately asked Jerome Bonaparte how many countries were involved in the currency union he formed. Jerome Bonaparte immediately responded, in addition to you, the first invited countries are the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the Principality of Luxembourg, the Kingdom of Württemberg, as well as Sardinia and the Austrian Empire. After hearing Jerome Bonaparte's invitation list, Leopold II felt that Belgium's entry into the currency union had indeed made some headway. However, at this time, he didn't know that besides the Kingdom of Belgium, Jerome Bonaparte had not notified the rest of the country at all, and the European Monetary Union in his mouth was just an empty shelf. Your Majesty, I will definitely persuade my father to join the currency union you formed. Leopold II said solemnly to Jerome Bonaparte, please believe in the Kingdom of Belgium, and it will definitely be firm. Follow in the footsteps of France, with your words, I'm relieved. Jerome Bonaparte replied to Leopold II with a smile. It's not too late. I wonder if you are interested in accompanying me. Head to the Tuileries Palace to dine. Of course. Leopold II repeatedly to Jerome Bonaparte. At the invitation of Jerome Bonaparte, Leopold II rode in a carriage to the Tuileries Palace. The carriage passed through and soon arrived at the Tuileries Palace. The two who got off the carriage walked up the steps talking and laughing. Mockert, who was standing in the hall, saw Jerome Bonaparte arrived and trotted to him. This is Mocker. Jerome Bonaparte introduced to Leopold II. If you need anything in Paris, you can call him at any time. If he can't solve it, I will solve it myself. Mr. Mocker. Leopold II nodded slightly to Mocker, although it is said that this is his second meeting with Mocker. This meeting is obviously different from the last one. His Royal Highness Leopold Mocha responded humbly. He knew that this King Leopold II had been absorbed into the circle of the Tuileries Palace, just like the King of Württemberg and the Kingdom of the Netherlands. As long as you have a day in Paris, I will be at your service. Thank you very much. Leopold II nodded slightly. Mocha, is there any food in the restaurant now? Jerome Bonaparte asked Mocha again. Your Majesty, there is more. Mocha replied. Then, take us to the restaurant and serve. Jerome Bonaparte ordered Mocha, as ordered. Mocha brought Jerome Bonaparte and Leopold II to the restaurant, and then poured a glass of Bordeaux wine for them. After finishing all this, Mocha left the restaurant, leaving only Jerome Bonaparte sitting in the main seat and Leopold II beside him. Leopold. Jerome Bonaparte glanced at the somewhat restrained Leopold. He raised his glass and said to Leopold II, you should know the rules of the Tuileries Palace, right? Leopold II showed a blank expression, shook his head, and replied to Jerome Bonaparte, Your Majesty, I don't know. The rules of the Tuileries Palace are. Jerome Bonaparte deliberately paused. There are no rules. A look of consternation appeared on Leopold II's face. Jerome Bonaparte's words reminded him of the time when he was invited to visit Louis Philippe, King of Orleans, at the invitation of King Louis Philippe of Orleans. The Queen of Louis Philippe, the grandmother of Leopold II, said the same thing. At that time she told Leopold II that the rules of the court of the Tuileries had ended with the end of the Orthodox Bourbon, and that the new Bourbon now had few rules. It's just that people he didn't expect, the Bonaparte family, who has always been obsessed with imitating noble etiquette, will have no rules. So, Leopold, you don't need to be so nervous when you are in front of me. Jerome Bonaparte said to Leopold in a relaxed tone, the age difference between the two of us is not the same. So big, 12 years difference. You can count me as a friend. Yeah. Leopold II responded softly, and the slightly nervous mood began to relax. As a young man in his early 20s, the complicated court etiquette is simply torture. That's it. Jerome Bonaparte raised his glass and said to Leopold II, let's toast to the friendship between France and Belgium. Leopold II hurriedly picked up the glass to send a blessing to Jerome Bonaparte. After a glass of wine, the tense atmosphere gradually to dissipate. When again Jerome Bonaparte picked up the wine bottle and was about to pour another glass for Leopold II himself, the quick-eyed Leopold II hurriedly brought the wine glass to Jerome Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte smiled and poured his wine. Continued cup, as plate after plate of delicacies came to the table. The wine in the glasses of Jerome Bonaparte and Leopold II also washed, and did not stop. The God is here. The topic of Jerome Bonaparte and Leopold II gradually opened up. After being slightly drunk, Leopold II, who was gradually drunk, began to swear at Britain's obstruction of the French-Belgian customs union. Jerome Bonaparte, along with Leopold II, was quite critical of the intervention in the Kingdom of Great Britain. How about we two countries form a steel community? Jerome Bonaparte moved out the predecessor of the European Union. Your Majesty, what is the steel community? Leopold asked curiously. That it's the steel of our two countries are all managed by a unified agency, which can control the production, investment, price, and distribution rights of the summer of our two countries. Jerome Bonaparte explained the institution to Leopold II. Your Majesty, how is this organization composed? Leopold II asked curiously. The appointment of the personnel of the institution is jointly recommended by the two of us. Jerome Bonaparte explained to Leopold II, copying the entire statute of the later European steel community. Your Majesty, if you have only two countries in your organization, I'm afraid it is impossible to form it. Leopold II immediately realized that the organization in the mouth of Jerome Bonaparte needs the coordination of multiple countries' success. You're right. Jerome Bonaparte nodded. So I'm going to carry out the plan to implement this coal and steel community after the currency union is implemented. Your Majesty, we are willing to join it. Leopold II immediately replied to Jerome Bonaparte. If you are willing, that would be great. Jerome Bonaparte was overjoyed. He did not expect that an organization that could only be achieved after 2 world wars would be completed in just a few words of his own. Oh, what a surprise. Of course, what he didn't know was that in Leopold II's idea, the so-called colon steel community was just a copy of the unfinished French-Belgian customs union. After the meal, Jerome Bonaparte looked at Leopold II, who was unconscious on the table, with blurred eyes, and said to Mocha, "Look at this Leopold, he is only no matter how much you drink, you're already drunk." Mocha didn't answer. He stood quietly waiting for Jerome Bonaparte's next order. After a while, Jerome Bonaparte slowly got up and said to Mocha, "Thank you for your troubles," and settled down Leopold II. As ordered, Mocha personally carried Leopold II away, and a colleague sent a servant to support Jerome Bonaparte. "Your Majesty, are you going to the room of Her Majesty Queen Augusta or another room?" the servant asked Jerome Bonaparte cautiously. "Other rooms," Jerome Bonaparte said decisively to the servant. With the help of his servants, Jerome Bonaparte arrived at a bedroom in the Tuileries Palace. Several servants carefully settled Jerome Bonaparte and left. At 7 a.m. the next day, Jerome Bonaparte opened his eyes and got up from the bed. At this time, his mind was still a little dizzy, and he immediately called the servants and asked them to prepare toiletries for himself. After a brief wash, Jerome Bonaparte was a little more awake. Then he went downstairs alone to take a walk in the garden outside the Tuileries Palace, where he met Queen Katerina again. At this time, Queen Katerina was walking in the gardens of the Tuileries Palace like him, and Jerome Bonaparte hurriedly greeted him warmly. "Morning, cousin." "Morning." Queen Katerina's attitude was obviously not as enthusiastic as the last time. She responded slyly. "Cousin, who are you angry with?" Jerome Bonaparte asked knowingly. "No one was born." Queen Katerina responded sullenly again. "Okay, cousin, don't be angry anymore." Jerome Bonaparte had no choice but to say softly, "I know you are angry at me for inviting Leopold II over here." "No." Queen Katerina stubbornly refused to admit it. "Cousin, it's not that I don't want to promise you this. It's just that the impact of your actions is too great." Jerome Bonaparte explained to Queen Katerina painstakingly, "Not to mention your merger, whether Belgium is legal or not, the Kingdom of Great Britain will never do this to you." Chapter 739. Pius IX arrives. "Cousin, even if there are conditions for agreeing to you, I'm afraid that the Kingdom of Britain will not agree to you doing this." Jerome Bonaparte explained it to Queen Katerina with great difficulty. "The Kingdom of Britain, why did they stop us?" Queen Katerina looked at Jerome Bonaparte in confusion. "They forced the Kingdom of Belgium into our hands." "Cousin, think about what they originally intended to hand over the Kingdom of Belgium to the Kingdom of the Netherlands." Jerome Bonaparte continued to ask Queen Katerina. Only then did Queen Katerina remember that the purpose of the Kingdom of Britain handing over the Kingdom of Belgium to them was to guard against the attack of France. To guard against France, A gratified smile appeared on Jerome Bonaparte's face. His cousin was not too stupid and sweet. "You are right. Their purpose at the beginning was to make you serve as the vanguard and stop France's progress. Times are different now, and the relationship between the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the French Empire is not as hostile as it once was. If I were Palmerston, I would definitely not agree to the request of the Netherlands to annex the Kingdom of Belgium. I will use all means to stop it, even if I end up in person." After listening to Jerome Bonaparte's words, a terrified expression appeared on Queen Katerina's face. The strength of the two countries, Britain and France, has long been shown incisively and vividly in this Crimean War. The Kingdom of the Netherlands is too capable of defeating the Kingdom of Belgium, but to defeat the Kingdom of Britain is nothing short of a fantasy. Cousin France should be able to stop the Kingdom of Britain. Queen Katerina began to pin her hopes on France. "Cousin, didn't you say yesterday that you don't need us from France?" Jerome Bonaparte showed a helpless expression. He found that women all have one thing in common, and what he said can be forgotten in a blink of an eye. "I didn't mean to let you guys take action, just..." Queen Katerina hesitated for a moment, then clenched her teeth and stomped her feet. "If you don't want to help, forget it." Jerome Bonaparte's face immediately showed a look of crying and laughing. Now he has no doubt that if a guy like Queen Katerina, who is dominated by emotions, is used as a diplomatic partition, the diplomacy of the entire Netherlands will probably be lost. "It's going to get bad, cousin. It's not that I don't want to help. Jerome Bonaparte spread his hands and said, "It's just that, if France helps you on this issue, then the whole of Europe will be plunged into a war again. It shouldn't be so serious." Queen Katerina responded suspiciously. Alas. Jerome Bonaparte sighed, "Britain has never once flinched in safeguarding its own interests. The whole of Europe can't stand the second devastation." Okay then, since Jerome Bonaparte was unwilling to support them, Queen Katerina had no choice but to give up. She sighed and nodded to Jerome Bonaparte. Then, Jerome Bonaparte told Queen Katerina of the idea of his currency union, and hoped that Queen Katerina could persuade the Kingdom of the Netherlands to join the currency union he formed. "Will the Kingdom of Belgium also join?" Queen Katerina asked slowly after squinting. "The reason why I invited Leopold over here is to persuade them to join the monetary union." Jerome Bonaparte replied to Queen Katerina, "Now the Kingdom of Belgium has initially agreed to join the monetary union." "I see." Queen Katerina nodded and responded dazedly, "I will pass on your words to William. It is up to him to join or not to join." After she finished speaking, Queen Katerina ignored Jerome Bonaparte and turned back to the Tuileries Palace. Jerome Bonaparte stood silently in place and said embarrassingly, "Alas, I'm still angry." In the next 2 days, Jerome Bonaparte arranged the Notre Dame Cathedral well, and at the same time, told the ambassador of the Kingdom of Württemberg about the currency union. The ambassador of Württemberg told Jerome Bonaparte that the Kingdom of Württemberg had adopted the currency system proposed by the Austrian Empire in 1853. "It doesn't matter, I will also invite the Austrian Empire to join it," Jerome Bonaparte said to the ambassador of Württemberg. "After the Austrian Empire joins, the whole of South Germany can implement the plan we made. All worlds, thank you for your understanding." The Württemberg ambassador nodded and replied to Jerome Bonaparte. For the Kingdom of Württemberg, joining the currency union plan proposed by Jerome Bonaparte is not as eager as the Kingdom of Belgium. However, the Kingdom of Württemberg still needs a stable currency system to stabilize the country. Historically, the Kingdom of Württemberg abandoned the currency standard system of the Austrian Empire around 1857 and joined the standard system of the more economically sound Kingdom of Prussia. Today, the currency alliance system of the French Empire is more secure than the currency of the Kingdom of Prussia, and joining France is naturally also within the consideration of the Kingdom of Württemberg. The Germany of this period is not like the Germany of 50 years later. The centripetal force of South Germany is much stronger than that of 50 years later. After the conversation with the ambassador of the Kingdom of Württemberg, Walewski appeared in Jerome Bonaparte's office. "Your Majesty," according to the Marseille City Hall telegram, His Holiness Pius IX arrived in Marseille an hour ago. Walewski reported to Jerome Bonaparte that lousy old man of Pius IX is finally here. Jerome Bonaparte whispered, "Yes, Your Majesty." Walewski nodded to Jerome Bonaparte. "How did your Ministry of Foreign Affairs arrange for Pius IX?" Jerome Bonaparte asked again. Walewski told Jerome Bonaparte that according to their arrangement, Pius IX would take a train from Marseille this afternoon, and was expected to arrive at Paris train station tomorrow morning. At that time, Jerome Bonaparte needed to take a carriage to the Paris train station in person to welcome Pope Pius IX. "Okay," Jerome Bonaparte responded sullenly, and the hot dog continued to say to Walewski, "However, I think there should be another item." "What project?" Walewski asked Jerome Bonaparte. "Come here and I'll tell you." So, Jerome Bonaparte immediately issued an order to block the Paris railway station to the guards stationed on the outskirts of Paris. That night, under the leadership of General Wayne, a battalion of soldiers pulled up the cordon at the Paris train station. In the early morning of the next day, the head of the royal family, Mocha, sent a maid early to Augusta's room to knock on the door. Who? Jerome Bonaparte, who was sleeping, opened his sleepy eyes and shouted loudly towards the door, "Your Majesty, it's time for you to get up." The maid outside the door whispered to Jerome Bonaparte in the room, "Okay, I see," Jerome Bonaparte said, and immediately closed his eyes again. After a while, the knock on the door reached Jerome Bonaparte again. "I got it. I got it," Jerome Bonaparte exclaimed once. This time, before he could close his eyes and take a nap again, Augusta beside him gently shook Jerome Bonaparte's body with his hands, preventing him from falling asleep. "Got it. Jerome Bonaparte opened his eyes again, while shaking slightly. Then, he took out the pocket watch pressed under the pillow, and glanced at the time. At 9:10, less than 50 minutes remained until Pope Pius IX arrived. I'm sorry, I'm going to be late. Jerome Bonaparte hurriedly put on the clothes that were scattered on the ground, piece by piece. Then, he took another look at Augusta, who was lying naked on the bed, and said, "Get up too. Pius IX is coming." "Yeah." Queen Augusta stretched and nodded lazily. After explaining the situation, Jerome Bonaparte immediately left Queen Augusta's room. Walking in the corridor, he met Mockert, who was walking towards him. You reading www.urkanshu.com. Mocker, how are the carriages I asked you to prepare last night? Jerome Bonaparte asked Mocker immediately. Everything is ready. Mocker replied to Jerome Bonaparte. That's good. Let's go at once, said Jerome Bonaparte. Your Majesty, why don't you eat a little something before leaving? Mocker suggested. There's still time to eat now. Jerome Bonaparte shook his head and refused. Let's go now. Yes. Mocker and Jerome Bonaparte walked quickly to the hall of the Tuileries Palace. Your Majesty, wait here for a while. I'll let the accompanying carriage come here. Hurry up. Time is running out. After waiting quietly in the hall for about 5 minutes, Mocker appeared again and told Jerome Bonaparte that the carriage and accompanying guards were already waiting under the. Jerome Bonaparte trotted out of the hall of the Tuileries Palace, and as he walked down the steps, he quickly got into a gilded open-top carriage. Go. Under Mocker's order, the carriage slowly started steps. The dragoons and cuirass quickly divided into 2 columns and surrounded the carriage in the middle to protect the safety of Jerome Bonaparte. Under the watchful eyes of the subjects on both sides of the street, Jerome Bonaparte soon arrived at the Paris train station at around 9:50. When he got off the carriage, he immediately reviewed the situation in the general way and railway station. After hearing that the train disappeared before it arrived, Jerome Bonaparte breathed a sigh of relief. Then, accompanied by General Vaillant, Jerome Bonaparte entered the Paris railway station and waited for the arrival of the train. At 10:05, a loud whistle was heard in the distance. Chapter 740, Pope, how many divisions does he have? At 10:10 in the morning, after the steam train slowly stopped, the exhausted Pope Pius IX and his entourage immediately appeared in the sight of Jerome Bonaparte. Well, poor Pius IX. Seeing the slightly embarrassed appearance of Pius IX in the carriage, Jerome Bonaparte couldn't help but gloat over his misfortune. For an old man who is in his 60s, long distance travel is indeed a difficult task. If he is not careful, he will explain it on the road. He, referring to Jerome Bonaparte, believes that if it were not for the joint dissuasion of the cardinals and the officials of the Papal State, and the words imposed by the Austrian Empire has the right to deny the appointment of the Pope, especially now that Catholicism is gradually spreading throughout Europe. In the case of going downhill, Pius IX would not say anything to come over who makes Catholicism. The Austrian Empire and the Papal State now rely on the French Empire to live their lives. Catholicism needs to use the powerful national power of the French Empire to spread its teachings around the world. The Austrian Empire needs to resist the Russian Empire with the support of the French Empire, and the Papal State is more it is necessary to rely on the French Empire to retain the existing land. Even if Pius IX is the Pope of Catholicism and the ruler of the Papal State, he cannot resist the joint imposition of the 3 parties. Otherwise, Pius IX is likely to face the end of being killed by illness. What's more, the reason why the Pope has been able to exist in this world for more than 1,000 years is that they have no bottom line. In the First Empire, where Napoleon was located, Pius VII, who claimed to have not run over to be crowned for more than 1,000 years, did not fearfully crown Napoleon under Napoleon's front. Since Pius VII was still able to do it with his face down, it made no sense that Pius IX could no longer sing praises for the Bonaparte family. Under the gaze of Jerome Bonaparte, Pius IX walked in front of Jerome Bonaparte step by step. After the two were speechless for a moment, Pius IX first spoke to the French monarch in front of him. Your Excellency Jerome Bonaparte, I have kept you waiting. Jerome Bonaparte's face immediately filled with a happy smile. He opened his arms and said to Pius IX, "Oh, my holy father, you have come." Pius IX also opened his arms slightly, and the two embraced enthusiastically, and then quickly separated. God bless you and your empire to defeat the Russian Empire and maintain the glory of Catholicism. Pius IX praised Jerome Bonaparte and his Second Empire in a lengthy tone. Your Majesty, with the unanimous consent of the Cardinal Conference, the Papal State will give you the title of Saint in recognition of your great contribution to the Holy See. I hope you will not refuse, although this so-called saint title is nothing in the eyes of the current Jerome Bonaparte, but as a filial son of God, he still calmly accepts the title given by Pius IX. Holy Father, I will continue to lead France, to fight for the glory of Catholicism. Jerome Bonaparte responded to Pius IX with a pious expression. Good. Pius IX also seemed satisfied with Jerome Bonaparte's filial piety. Right. Holy Father, I have another good news to tell you. Jerome Bonaparte then said to Pope Pius IX, Your Majesty, I'm all ears. Pius IX replied to Jerome Bonaparte, wait until the Paris Conference of several months is over, and you will see a Catholic power re-establish itself on the ground of Europe. Said Jerome Bonaparte slowly but passionately. You mean Poland? Pius IX responded to Jerome Bonaparte, Holy Father, I didn't expect you to know so soon. Jerome Bonaparte continued to respond, that child of Maximilian has already told me everything. Pius IX responded to Jerome Bonaparte with a slightly trembling voice. He never thought that when he was the Pope, he would still see a Catholic the state was re-established in Europe. Then, I'm doing this too much. Jerome Bonaparte shook his shoulders slightly and said helplessly. And Archduke Maximilian, who arrived with Pius IX, showed an embarrassed look. He couldn't help feeling ashamed that he had informed Pius IX in advance that Poland was re-established. Originally, it should be said that Jerome Bonaparte personally informed Pius IX in a way of surprise, but now due to Maximilian's improved notification, there are no surprises. No, Your Majesty, your contribution to the Lord cannot be denied at any time. Pius IX hurriedly said to Jerome Bonaparte, I am truly honored to hear your praise from the Holy Father. Jerome Bonaparte also responded humbly. Then, at the invitation of Jerome Bonaparte, Pius IX went with him to the carriage that Jerome Bonaparte was in. When he was about to board the carriage, Jerome Bonaparte turned to face him. Archduke Maximilian invited. Maximilian, would you like to accompany us in the carriage? Me. Archduke Maximilian shook his head and refused. Your Majesty, I'm better off. Then you will take another carriage to the Tuileries Palace first. When you get there, you will ask Mocket to prepare the room. Jerome Bonaparte, like an understanding big brother, said Archduke Maximilian exhorted. Yes. Archduke Maximilian replied with a smile and nodding. The main purpose of Grand Duke Maximilian's visit to Paris was not to deepen the ties with France. After all, he was about to serve as the Kingdom of Poland, but there were a large number of generals who were close to France. By the way, all of Warsaw and its environs are now occupied by Polish Zionist armies, all of them close to French generals. After the warning, Jerome Bonaparte got into the carriage, and Grand Duke Maximilian also left in another carriage. After the two carriages left the train station, they divided into two routes, one of which went to the Tuileries Palace, while the other was also near the Arc de Triomphe. Pius IX in the carriage looked at the carriage that was gradually receding and couldn't help showing a trace of panic in his heart. According to the plan, they didn't have to go straight to the Tuileries Palace. Why should they be separated from Maximilian? Your Majesty, where are we going? Pius IX asked Jerome Bonaparte timidly. Holy Father, you'll know when you arrive. Jerome Bonaparte said to Pius IX with a smile on his face. He knew that his next actions would definitely make Pius IX resent him. It doesn't matter what, he who rules an empire doesn't care about the likes and dislikes of Jiushi, as long as he can guarantee the safety of the Papal State and maintain the stability of the Apennine Peninsula, then the Papal State can only crawl under his feet. And the reason why he would do this is also to avenge his one-shot revenge in the Papal State. As we all know, Jerome Bonaparte was a very careful man. The carriage took Pius IX and Jerome Bonaparte all the way to a place more than 200 meters away from the Arc de Triomphe and stopped. Jerome Bonaparte turned to Pope Pius IX and said, Holy Father, we are going for a while now. Okay. Pius IX nodded, then followed Jerome Bonaparte out of the carriage. Pius IX, who got off the carriage, looked ahead only to find that under the Arc de Triomphe more than 200 meters in front of him, there was a French army that was fully armed. Your Majesty, what do you mean? Pius IX said to Jerome Bonaparte with a hint of grief and indignation. Holy Father. Jerome Bonaparte deliberately pretended to be innocent and replied to Pius IX, I just want to invite the Holy Father to inspect the French army. Don't you like it, Holy Father? A reluctant smile appeared on Pius IX's face. He slowly nodded to Jerome Bonaparte and said, I like it. Then the Holy Father, come with me. Jerome Bonaparte helped Pius IX intimately to continue. Reading www.urkanshu.com. When Jerome Bonaparte and Pius IX arrived at a position less than 100 meters away from the Arc de Triomphe, Chief of General Staff Neil, who served as the temporary commander, appeared in front of Jerome Bonaparte and Pius IX. Salute to Jerome Bonaparte. Good work, Neil, said Jerome Bonaparte sternly. Under the leadership of Neil, Jerome Bonaparte and Pius IX came to the French army phalanx under the Arc de Triomphe. The soldiers in the phalanx showed murderous expressions, which made Pius IX, who had been pampered for many years, have weak legs. Holy Father, these are the soldiers who fought for a truce in Crimea. Jerome Bonaparte said to Pius IX with a smile. As a monarch who has stayed in the Crimean Peninsula for half a year, this little scene still can't scare him. Pius IX stumbled in French to thank the soldiers present, and praise them as the Lord's most faithful defenders. The soldiers who heard Pius IX's praise showed a sincere smile on their faces. They came from the countryside, and accepted the subtle input from priests and local nobles, since they were young, so they believed in God more than urban people. Pius IX's words are undoubtedly affirming their credit, and making them less guilty of killing their compatriots on the Crimean Peninsula. Long live His Majesty Bonaparte, long live His Majesty the Pope. Under Neil's order, all the soldiers shouted diligently, and at the same time, leaned their bayonets forward. The cold light on the bayonet shone in Pius IX's eyes, causing Pius IX to feel a sudden chill. Perhaps, because of the bayonet visit, Pius IX was extraordinarily rigid when he baptized Frederick the next day. Ultimate chaos. However, this is another story. Chapter 741. Distressed Holy Father. Pius IX, who had visited the French array and the artillery array, was pulled back into the carriage by Jerome Bonaparte in a daze. Holy Father, how do you think the group of soldiers under my command are doing? Jerome Bonaparte on the carriage asked Pius IX with an undisguised self-satisfied expression on his face. Majestic teacher. Pius IX, who had not yet recovered, said dryly, compared with my uncle's army? Jerome Bonaparte asked Pius IX again. He was a little curious about the difference between him and his unmasked uncle. Your Majesty, I'm afraid this is difficult to compare. Pius IX said to Jerome Bonaparte politely. I see. Jerome Bonaparte showed a look of disappointment on his face. Afterwards, Jerome Bonaparte and Pius IX drove westwards all the way, and soon came to the Tuileries Palace. Holy Father, let's get out of the car. Jerome Bonaparte opened the car door and helped Pius IX down, and then accompanied Pius IX into the hall of the Tuileries Palace step by step. At this time, the hall of the Tuileries Palace was already full of guests. Under the gazes of everyone, Jerome Bonaparte and Pius IX appeared in front of them. The guests greeted Pius IX and Jerome Bonaparte one after another, and Jerome Bonaparte and Pius IX also responded to present one by one. Immediately afterwards, Jerome Bonaparte opened his mouth and said to everyone present, today I'm honored to be able to invite the Pope of the Papal State, the Holy Father, who everyone is also here. All monarchs call Pius IX the Holy Father. Pius IX, His Majesty has arrived at the Tuileries Palace to baptize my son, Frederick Bonaparte. France and the Holy See have been two countries that have been friends from generation to generation since ancient times, and we have supported and assisted each other for a long time. After hearing this sentence, the guests present showed expressions of wanting to laugh, but not daring to laugh, and Pius IX's face also showed a touch of embarrassment. Who doesn't know the **** between France and the Holy See? The Avignon Palace is a palace specially set up for the Pope by the big dutiful son of France. Many popes have lived in Avignon, the most recent of which is Pius VII. Decades ago, my uncle invited Pius VII to visit Paris, and the French Empire also broke up with the Holy See at that time. Decades later, His Majesty Pius IX was invited by me to come to Paris again. I believe that the exchanges between the Holy See and the French Empire will become even closer because of this exchange. After Jerome Bonaparte's tirade was over, aside from himself, the expressions of everyone present were a little unbearable, and the most difficult of them was Pius IX himself. He even had some doubts whether Jerome Bonaparte called him here to baptize his child, or whether he called him here to insult him. Holy Father, I don't know if you have anything to say. Jerome Bonaparte asked Pope Pius IX in a respectful manner. Read novel. After being silent for a long time, Pius IX said, I hope this visit will promote a more in-depth communication between the French Empire and the Holy See. As soon as Pius IX finished speaking, Queen Augusta appeared in front of Pius IX holding Frederick Bonaparte. Holy Father, Empress Augusta, holding Frederick, saluted Pius IX with a reverent look. Seeing the attitude of the Empress, who had been educated by the church since childhood, Pius IX finally felt a little better. Although the church cannot influence Jerome Bonaparte, who is without a king and no father, as long as the church can make Queen Augusta and the future Crown Prince Frederick tender to them. Your Majesty. Pius IX also returned the salute to Queen Augusta. Holy Father, this is Frederick. Queen Augusta hugged Frederick to Pius IX. Pius IX gently took over his godson with his hands, and Frederick, who was held in his arms by Pius IX, cried out, a pair of chubby smiling faces showing a happy smile. My child, you live in a distinguished family. Your father is the monarch of the whole of France, and everything in France is under his control, and your mother is the most beautiful pious queen in the world. From the moment you were born, you were destined to be favored and watched by the Lord. Pius IX said to Frederick in a solemn tone, and his colleagues did not forget to praise Jerome Bonaparte and Queen Augusta. God's love will pour out on you continuously, and God's grace will come to you like a tide. After Pius IX finished speaking, he returned Frederick Bonaparte to Queen Augusta. Thank you, Holy Father. Queen Augusta saluted Pius IX again. Immediately, under the personal reception of Jerome Bonaparte, Pope Pius IX was placed in a room. After settling down Pius IX, Jerome Bonaparte invited the rest of the guests to the restaurant, Mr. Zhang, for lunch. The whole lunch took nearly 2 hours, and Jerome Bonaparte, who was full, watched the guests leave. After everything was over, Jerome Bonaparte returned to Augusta's room. At this time, Empress Augusta was breastfeeding Frederick. The appearance of Jerome Bonaparte shocked Augusta, and she whispered to her why she didn't come in. Knock first. Jerome Bonaparte confidently said to Queen Augusta, this is my room, why should I knock on the door? Queen Augusta shook her head and smiled. Jerome Bonaparte, who was sitting next to Queen Augusta, put her hand on Frederick's face and pinched it gently. Friedrich's tender little face blamed and said, you kid is much happier than me when I was a child. Frederick, whose face was pinched by Jerome Bonaparte, shouted yeah, as if to protest against Jerome Bonaparte's atrocity. Queen Augusta rolled her eyes at Jerome Bonaparte, then slapped Jerome Bonaparte fiercely on the back of the hand and said, how old are you? Jerome Bonaparte locked his hands back and smirked twice at Queen Augusta. By the way, did your speech in the hall just now deliberately target the Holy Father? Said the Queen Augusta to Jerome Bonaparte in a reproachful tone. How is that possible? Pius IX is the person I most respect. Jerome Bonaparte shook his head and replied to Queen Augusta, humph. Queen Augusta snorted softly. She didn't believe Jerome Bonaparte's nonsense. Okay. Jerome Bonaparte shrugged and reluctantly replied to Queen Augusta, I admit, I do have some opinions about that old fellow of Pius IX. Well, I remember that this is the first time you met. Queen Augusta looked at Jerome Bonaparte curiously. That was before I became president. Jerome Bonaparte told Queen Augusta about what he had done to Pius IX before he became president. At the beginning, he worked hard to gain the support of Pope Pius IX. Now, in 30 years of Hedon and 30 years of Hexy, he must not entertain Pope Pius IX properly. After listening to Jerome Bonaparte's triumphant words, Queen Augusta really didn't know what to say. Don't worry. That bad old man of Pius IX is not an unreasonable person. Jerome Bonaparte responded confidently to Queen Augusta, even if I insult Pius VII like my uncle now insulting him the same way, he has to endure this humiliation. Jerome Bonaparte's arrogant remarks startled Queen Augusta, although she herself does not have much respect for the so-called god. You read www.orcanshu.com, but she knew that, if there was a conflict between the Bonaparte family and the church, only Bourbon and Orleans would gain. Queen Augusta hurriedly reminded Jerome Bonaparte, "Jerome, don't be impulsive, don't worry." Jerome Bonaparte replied, "I don't care about Pius IX. He is an indispensable tool for us to rule France. I just want Pius IX to know that the safety of the papal state does not depend on them, but on me." Yeah. Queen Augusta nodded and agreed with Jerome Bonaparte's words. Pius IX really needs to have a sense of awe for the Bonaparte family. Immediately afterwards, Queen Augusta asked the Marquis Allais again, "Marquis Allais, have you been there yet?" "No." Jerome Bonaparte shook his head with a hint of shame. "Then why don't you hurry up?" Queen Augusta blamed. "Then I'll go," said Jerome Bonaparte to Queen Augusta. "Go." Queen Augusta urged again. After Jerome Bonaparte left, tears streamed down Queen Augusta's face. On the other hand, Jerome Bonaparte, who left the Tuileries Palace in a carriage, soon came to the residence of the Marquis of Allais, and knocked on the door of the Marquis Allais. "Your Majesty," said the maid who was in charge of opening the door, looking at Jerome Bonaparte in surprise. "Is Madam at home?" Jerome Bonaparte asked in a low voice. "Yes, Your Majesty." The maid nodded, and hurriedly led Jerome Bonaparte to the room of the Marquis of Allais. In the room, he saw the Marquis Allais and the baby in the arms of the Marquis Allais. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 742, Lost Lover. Looking at the Marquis of Allais who was breastfeeding on the sofa, Jerome Bonaparte showed a loving expression and his lips twitched slightly. Compared to Jerome Bonaparte, whose expression was a little rude, the Marquis of Allais had an unprecedented calm expression on her face. With the baby in her arms, she slowly got up from the sofa and turned to Jerome Bonaparte. Bacchianchi and saluted. "Your Majesty." The change of the Marquis of Allais made Jerome Bonaparte's originally fiery heart instantly feel as if a basin of cold water had been poured into it. After standing there for a while, he opened his mouth again and apologized to the Marquis Allais in a low voice. "I am sorry, Your Majesty." The Marquis Allais responded with a lukewarm expression. "You don't need to tell me. The person you are most sorry for is not me, but Her Majesty the Queen. I'm sorry for Augusta, and I'm sorry for you." Jerome Bonaparte apologized to the Marquis of Allais again. "I'm here to make up for your mother and son." Compensation. The Marquis of Allais frowned and responded to Jerome Bonaparte. "Your Majesty, you don't need to compensate me. Instead, I want to thank you for bringing an heir to our family." "Madam, what do you mean?" Jerome Bonaparte said coldly, with a hint of anger in his words. In the face of Jerome Bonaparte's wrath, the Marquis of Allais was extraordinarily calm. She told Jerome Bonaparte leisurely that this child would inherit the title of Marquis Allais and become the Marquis of Allais. "Madam, this is our child," said Jerome Bonaparte to the Marchioness of Allais. "Your Majesty." The Marquis Allais also retorted, not to be outdone, "This is not our child, but my child." After all, the Marquis of Allais held the baby tightly in her arms, for fear that he would be snatched away by Jerome Bonaparte. "Madam." Looking at the vigilant Marquis of Allais, Jerome Bonaparte said to the Marquis of Allais with a wry smile, "Why are you doing this? Don't forget, your husband, the Marquis of Allais, still in the Navy, believe it or not." Before Jerome Bonaparte could finish speaking, the Marquis of Allais interrupted Jerome Bonaparte and said, "Your Majesty, my husband has already died in the Far East." Jerome Bonaparte was stunned for a few seconds, and then hurriedly asked, "When did the Marquis of Allais die?" The Marquis of Allais told Jerome Bonaparte that the Marquis of Allais died half a year ago, and the news of his death spread 2 months ago. The news came from a steamboat that arrived in Paris from Guangzhou. Ship came. The reason why Marquis Allais died was because he drank unclean water and died. After listening to the description of the Marquis of Allais, Jerome Bonaparte whispered to the Marquis Allais, "Madam, condolences." He said in the letter that, although this child did not belong to him, he also lived in the most precious treasure bestowed upon him, So he hoped that this child would inherit his title and become the new Marquis. The Marquis of Alais continued to Jerome Bonaparte said, and then looked at Jerome Bonaparte with pleading eyes. Your Majesty, I beg you to let this child go. Jerome Bonaparte paused, looked at the baby in the arms of the Marquis of Alais, and pointed out the window calmly and said, Ma'am, I can let go, but how do you fight against those who wandered back to the castle? In the hands of the jackal, tiger, and leopard, protect your child. Now you are not the only people who want to be eligible to inherit the Marquis property. Marquis Alais also has immediate family members and illegitimate children. The reason why they didn't take action against you is all because of my face. If I declare that I don't recognize you and your children's titles, guess what those people will do? Jerome Bonaparte's words were like a sharp knife, cutting through the fact that the Marquis of Alais was unwilling to face. That's right, the reason why the relatives of Marquis Alais didn't do anything to their mother and son was entirely out of the emperor's face. No one knew whether the emperor attached great importance to this illegitimate child or not. If the emperor did attach importance to it, then they bullied the mother and son of the Marquis of Alais and slapped Jerome Bonaparte in the face. It is obviously not worthwhile to offend an imperial monarch for the property of the Marquis of Alais. Once Jerome Bonaparte revealed that he did not take this child seriously, or even did not want to have too much contact with the child, the Marquis of Alais would have to face those who wanted to drive her out of the castle and the Marquis relatives whose possessions devoured them. No, you can't do that, said the page header of the Marchioness of Alais to Jerome Bonaparte. Madam, why can't I do this? Jerome Bonaparte asked back, since you choose to cut off your relationship with me, then you have to pay the price of cutting off your relationship. Anyway, he is your child too. The Marchioness of Alais then said to Jerome Bonaparte, Ma'am, I may have many illegitimate children in the future. Do I have to shelter every illegitimate child? Jerome Bonaparte showed a disdainful smile on the corner of his mouth. In the European succession system, illegitimate children did not have any right to inherit unless they were granted the emperor's permission. However, even the emperor cannot use his power to convert all illegitimate children into positive ones. The Marquis of Alais pointed at Jerome Bonaparte and could not say a word, but in the end she could only say, I really saw you wrong. Madam, I'm just telling the truth. Jerome Bonaparte spread his hands and responded to the Marquis of Alais, to be honest, I don't want to be like this. Your Majesty, I implore you to grant this child the right to inherit the deceased Marquis title. The Marquis of Alais said to Jerome Bonaparte in a low voice. Madam, do you want our child to inherit someone else's title? Jerome Bonaparte asked the Marquis of Alais, if I agree to your request, then this child has nothing to do with me. No more. Your Majesty. The Marchioness of Alais said to Jerome Bonaparte, if his surname is Bonaparte, what can he get? The hatred between His Royal Highness Prince Frederick and His Majesty Queen Augusta? The contempt of member of the Nabal family, the Marquis Alais, who was staying in the court, knew too well how illegitimate children would be treated in the court, and she was not willing to let her son fall into the whirlpool of the court. Jerome Bonaparte was silent for a moment, then assured the Marquis of Alais, Ma'am, I can assure you that he will never encounter the things mentioned above. Your Majesty, even so, I won't let his surname Bonaparte, you just give it up. Mother's love made the Marquis Alais firm. If it is really impossible to inherit the castle and the title, then I will take him with me back to the country life. Looking at the stubborn Marquis of Alais, Jerome Bonaparte finally chose to back down. He sighed and said to the Marquis Alais, Madam, you have won. I will issue an order to officially grant it to your child. The right to inherit the title of Marquis, Your Majesty. Thank you very much, said the Marquis of Alais, bowing to Jerome Bonaparte. Madam, are you really not going back with me? Jerome Bonaparte tried to keep the Marquis of Alais. Your Majesty, the Tuileries Palace is not suitable for me. The Marquis of Alais replied firmly to Jerome Bonaparte. Later, the Marquis of Alais told Jerome Bonaparte that she would go to settle in the south after selling the Marquis's estate in Paris. Looking at the determined woman in front of him, Jerome Bonaparte knew that his fate with her was probably over. I understand. Jerome Bonaparte nodded and said to the Marcos Alais, and then told the Marcos Alais that she would help her contact the person who sold the property. The Marchioness of Alais once again expressed her gratitude to Jerome Bonaparte. Then www.riyadh1.com. Jerome Bonaparte left the castle of the Marquis of Alais and returned to the bedroom of Queen Augusta dejectedly. "What's wrong? Queen Augusta in the room could ask Jerome Bonaparte." Jerome Bonaparte was about to tell Augusta the news about himself and the Marquis of Alais, which concealed the part that Jerome Bonaparte threatened the Marquis of Alais. Queen Augusta thought for a moment and told Jerome Bonaparte that the Marquis of Alais was determined to stay away from Paris. "I really think so too." Jerome Bonaparte nodded and responded to Queen Augusta, "Your Majesty, since she is no longer willing to stay in Paris, then you can fulfill all her wishes." Queen Augusta was glad that she was lost, that the Marquis of Alais had risen, and she was also grateful to the Marquis of Alais. Feeling disappointed to leave, there are not many people in the entire court who can be called friends by Augusta, and the Marquis of Alais is one of them. Jerome Bonaparte, who had left from Queen Augusta, called Mockett and gave him an order to turn the illegitimate son of the Marquis of Alais into a regular position. After hearing Jerome Bonaparte's order, Mockett nodded and said that he would definitely solve the problem as soon as possible. And Jerome Bonaparte, who had finished his assignment, returned to the study to deal with the documents at noon the next day at the solemn mass of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Pope Pius IX in a white papal uniform appeared on the podium with a solemn face. The rows of seats below him are full of people. They are the crown princes, grand dukes, ambassadors of various countries, as well as the generals and senior bureaucrats of the empire. Crown Prince Frederick Bonaparte will be baptized under the double witness of religious and secular rites. Chapter 743. Baptism begins. With the appearance of Pius IX, Jerome Bonaparte in a black formal suit and Queen Augusta in a white dress also followed on the red carpet. Everyone sitting in the seats hurriedly stood up and saluted Jerome Bonaparte and Augusta until Jerome Bonaparte and Augusta walked onto the stage. "Your Majesty, Empress." Pius IX bowed slightly to Jerome Bonaparte and Augusta to show respect. "Holy Father." Jerome Bonaparte and Augusta also bowed slightly to return the salute. After a brief greeting, Pope Pius IX opened his hands and said to Queen Augusta, "Your Majesty, please give me my godson, Frederick, and I will baptize him in person." Queen Augusta slowly stretched out her hand and handed the Crown Prince Frederick Bonaparte in her arms to Pius IX. After Pius IX took over Frederick, he responded to Jerome Bonaparte and Empress Augusta, "Your Majesty, Empress, could you please stand there and wait for a moment?" Seeing Frederick Bonaparte being held in the arms of Pius IX, Queen Augusta showed a sad expression on her face. Although Queen Augusta's original intention was also for Frederick's future, she still felt very uncomfortable when she thought of the torture that Frederick would suffer in the future. "Augusta, leave Friedrich to the Holy Father." Jerome Bonaparte grabbed Augusta's hand and brought her to the edge of the main altar. Standing in the center of the main altar, Pope Pius IX immediately ordered the singing troupe of Notre Dame de Paris to sing the mass again. At the same time, he slowly beckoned to the bishops behind him. A bishop appeared in the shelter next to the ninth generation. Pius IX, who was holding Friedrich Bonaparte, officially began to act. He handed the clothes wrapped around Friedrich Bonaparte to the bishop one by one. After a while, a naked Crown Prince Frederick appeared. Since it was only February, the temperature in Paris was still a little cold. After the naked Friedrich Bonaparte felt the chills, he kept screaming "Yeah," as if he was complaining. Pius IX. This made Augusta, who was standing on the stage, unable to resist the urge to rush over. If Jerome Bonaparte hadn't held the Queen Augusta firmly, the current Queen Augusta would have been long ago. He had already run to Pius IX and demanded the end. "Augusta, calm down." Jerome Bonaparte whispered to Queen Augusta, but, mother's love made Queen Augusta feel like a knife, and at this time she began to regret why she insisted on having Pius IX baptized for Frederick. "Nothing." Jerome Bonaparte shook his head and said softly to Queen Augusta with a firm gaze. Queen Augusta had to obey Jerome Bonaparte's orders, but her eyes were still fixed on Frederick Bonaparte, for fear that he might make any mistakes. Immediately afterwards, under the watchful eyes of everyone present, a priest slowly brought a basin of water with a slight tinge of steam, and Queen Augusta and Jerome Bonaparte breathed a sigh of relief at the same time. In Jerome Bonaparte's heart, he couldn't help but feel that the Holy See is indeed a political system that can last for thousands of years, and they can always adapt to changes at any time. Just like the holy water being brought up by priests now, Pius IX did not dare to pour cold water on Frederick directly, and he was also afraid of the root cause of Frederick's illness in such a cold day. If something really happened to the crown prince, let alone the emperor and his wife, even the important officials of the Second Empire would not let Pius IX and the papal state go. After all, the rights of the important ministers of the Second Empire depended on the Bonaparte family. If they wanted to keep their glory and wealth from being liquidated, they could only maintain the time of the Second Empire in France as much as possible. Frederick Bonaparte was one of their hopes afterwards. Pius IX began to recite the prayer to Frederick Bonaparte, and after the prayer was over, he blessed him with a devout look on his face. After some tossing, Frederick Bonaparte didn't want to shout like before. He looked at the old man who was holding him in his arms with curious eyes, and from time to time he let out a giggling laughter. Pius IX also showed a gratified smile on his wrinkled face. Although he said that he hated Jerome Bonaparte, a guy who did not respect God, he did not hate Frederick Bonaparte. Some even like this cute little guy. After all, most people miss the past the older they get, and they sometimes instill this nostalgia in their young lives. My godson, the Lord's eyes have been on you since the moment you were born. As Pius IX said, he handed over Frederick Bonaparte to the Bishop of Notre Dame beside him. The Bishop of Notre Dame de Paris gently held Frederick above the wooden basin at home, waiting for Pius IX to start. Pius IX picked up the gilded vessel and scooped the water to the vessel, watering Frederick Bonaparte all over soon. After the whole body of Frederick Bonaparte was watered, Pius IX once again ordered the priest beside him to wipe the body of the Crown Prince. After the body of Crown Prince Frederick was completely wiped dry, Pius IX closed Frederick's new clothes again. The originally suspended mass was sung again, and Jerome Bonaparte and Queen Augusta once again stood in the center of the main altar under the order of Pope Pius IX. Empress Augusta, who took Frederick Bonaparte in both hands, once again expressed her gratitude to Pope Pius IX, and Jerome Bonaparte also expressed her gratitude to Pius IX. In a solemn mass, baptism 10 officially ended. Pius IX, his entourage, and the bishop left the main altar. Jerome Bonaparte, Queen Augusta and the guests returned to Tuileries in a carriage palace. On the way to the Tuileries palace by carriage, Jerome Bonaparte looked at Frederick Bonaparte, who was being embraced by Augusta. He felt that he proposed to Queen Augusta a recommendation. Augusta, what's wrong? Queen Augusta raised her head and looked at Jerome Bonaparte. I have a suggestion. Do you want to listen to it? Jerome Bonaparte said to Augusta. What advice? Queen Augusta asked. I want to take all the children born in the 2 days of Friedrich Bonaparte's birth and baptism as godsons and goddaughters. What do you think? Jerome Bonaparte asked Queen Augusta. One sentence. Are you crazy? Queen Augusta asked Jerome Bonaparte in surprise. No. Jerome Bonaparte shook his head and replied to Queen Augusta. I'm not crazy. I think this is a way to connect us closely with our subjects. Now that we are both parents, we should play an exemplary role in France. We are not only the parents of Frederick, but also the fathers of the whole of France. After Queen Augusta thought for a moment, she also thought that what Jerome Bonaparte said was indeed reasonable. So, Queen Augusta nodded and said to Jerome Bonaparte, just do as you say. When Jerome Bonaparte arrived at the Tuileries Palace by carriage, Moquet, who is now at the gate of the Tuileries Palace, hurriedly trotted to Jerome Bonaparte's side to open the door for him. Jerome Bonaparte, who got off the carriage, immediately told Moquet that he must publish news in tomorrow's newspaper. The content of the news is, the child born on the 2 days of the birth and baptism of the Prince Frederick will be the godsons of the King and Queen. Moquet said, please rest assured, Your Majesty, he will definitely handle this matter. A grand banquet was held in the Tuileries Palace. The banquet lasted for nearly 3 hours before it stopped. When Jerome Bonaparte, who had finished the banquet, was about to return to work, he suddenly received news that Archduke Maximilian requested to receive him. Maximilian's Jerome Bonaparte was stunned for a few seconds, then patted his head and said to himself, "Damn, I almost forgot. Mocha, you immediately take Grand Duke Maximilian to the study and tell him to wait in the study for a while." Jerome Bonaparte called Mocha again and said, "Yes, Your Majesty." Mocha nodded and replied to Jerome Bonaparte. Jerome Bonaparte immediately walked out of the Tuileries Palace and left again in a carriage. The carriage led Jerome Bonaparte to the gates of a group of mansions in the Saint-Germain district. "Wait for me here for a while." After speaking, Jerome Bonaparte went straight to the mansion and knocked on the door of the mansion. "Who?" a voice asked from inside the mansion. "Me, Jerome Bonaparte." Jerome Bonaparte responded sternly. Hearing the name of Jerome Bonaparte, the mansion opened immediately. An old man with a wrinkled face appeared in front of Jerome Bonaparte. He hurriedly saluted Jerome Bonaparte and said, "Your Majesty, why are you here in person? What? Are you not welcome, Mr. Czartoryski?" Jerome Bonaparte smiled in response to the old man in front of him. "Welcome, of course." The old man quickly shook his head and said enthusiastically to Jerome Bonaparte, "Your Majesty, whenever you come over, you will receive a warm welcome. Every Poles will never forget, Your Majesty, your contribution to Poland." Chapter 744, Maximilian's Condition. Before we start the conversation, let's start with an introduction to Czartoryski. King Czartoryski of Kin, born in Warsaw in 1770, served several tsars including Queen Catherine, and his official position under the tsar once reached a position below one person and above 10,000 people. Said his existence is a living fossil. It is such a minister who was deeply trusted by Alexander I, but now he is the indisputable core of the entire Polish Zionism. It is precisely because of such a highly respected person as Prince Czartoryski that Polish Zionism can be closely linked together. We will not break up because of interest issues for the time being. And why Czartoryski betrayed the Tsar who gave him his trust and joined the ranks of Polish Zionism is another long story. I won't go into too much detail here now. Led by Czartoryski, Jerome Bonaparte sat on the sofa in the mansion. "Your Majesty, what are your orders for coming to me?" Czartoryski, who had just sat down, asked Jerome Bonaparte. "I want to ask, do you have a complete plan for Poland in the future?" Jerome Bonaparte asked Czartoryski. "Your Majesty, we plan to establish a republic in the new Poland." Czartoryski gushed about the future political blueprint of the Polish Republic to Jerome Bonaparte. After listening to Czartoryski's words, Jerome Bonaparte was silent for a while and then replied to Czartoryski, "Mr. Czartoryski, I understand your Polish desire to establish a republic, but I'm afraid I can't. I promise you this condition." Czartoryski's face was obviously sluggish, and his face showed a wry smile, and said to Jerome Bonaparte, "Your Majesty, I know that you are planning to establish a principality in Poland, right? Just like Napoleon back then. His Majesty established the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, Mr. Czartoryski." Jerome Bonaparte said to Prince Czartoryski unhurriedly, "Since you already know our attitude, then I think you should also be aware of the establishment in Poland. What kind of situation a republic will face." "I know." Czartoryski responded to Jerome Bonaparte in a slightly low tone. "In the eyes of all monarchies, the republic is like a heresy, and no country can tolerate such a heresy appears. Mr. Czartoryski, since you understand everything, then I don't need to go into too much detail." Jerome Bonaparte calmly said to Czartoryski, "Although I'm a republic for Poland, the monarchy doesn't have any particular inclinations, but I'd also consider the opening of other countries as well. If the new Poland rashly implements a republic, then you will have no benefit other than the hostility of the surrounding monarchies." "Your Majesty, I understand what you mean. You must have chosen a suitable successor for us." Czartoryski asked Jerome Bonaparte again. "You're right." Jerome Bonaparte nodded and replied to Czartoryski, "I have chosen a suitable successor for you, and he is now at the Tuileries Palace." "Who is it?" Czartoryski responded curiously to Jerome Bonaparte. "Grand Duke Maximilian." Jerome Bonaparte replied to Czartoryski. Hearing Jerome Bonaparte's answer, Czartoryski showed a trace of resistance on his face. He politely asked Jerome Bonaparte if he could replace another person as Grand Duke of Poland, the Habsburg family. As the Grand Duke, it will affect the national mood of the Kingdom of Poland. After all, Galicia and Krakow are still in the hands of the Austrian Empire. Czartoryski, please rest assured Jerome Bonaparte hurriedly explained to Czartoryski, the new Poland will not have a territorial dispute with the Austrian Empire. Maxi. Archduke Milian is about to be awarded the title of Grand Duke of Galicia Krakow by the Emperor of the Austrian Empire. That is to say, as long as you agree with Maximilian as the Grand Duke, then Krakow and Galicia will return without a fight in your hands. As soon as Jerome Bonaparte's voice fell, Czartoryski immediately replied to Jerome Bonaparte, Your Majesty, I agree with Grand Duke Maximilian to be the Grand Duke of Warsaw. Mr. Czartoryski, Jerome Bonaparte said to Czartoryski with a solemn expression, I'm looking for you, not only to ask for your personal consent, I hope that you will be able to guarantee all Poland's political parties will be as loyal to Maximilian as you are. I don't want to see the people I choose cast out by you. If that's the case, then I consider whether Poland should exist as an independent entity or whether he should be relocated under the command of the Russian Empire. I believe that any government is willing to accept this gift from the sky. Facing the threat of Jerome Bonaparte, Czartoryski, who pinned his hopes on the future Polish parliament, was instantly shattered. Originally, Czartoryski wanted to consolidate power through the future parliament, thus turning the Kingdom of Poland into a virtual monarch system. Just like what Duke Golitsyn is doing now in the Russian Empire. Your Majesty, I'm just an old man over 80 years old. The job of forcing all parties to swear allegiance to Grand Duke Maximilian is too difficult. Czartoryski showed weakness to Jerome Bonaparte. After all, relying on their own prestige to suppress the people below, to make them restrain their ambitions is indeed a thankless thing. If the trouble is not good, the party suppressed by him will target him. Mr. Czartoryski, I believe that no one else can suppress the current Poland. But if it is you, I will not believe it. Because you are the only one who can suppress political parties in the entire Polish region, said Jerome Bonaparte to Czartoryski with a determined weapon. Your Majesty, you are in love. Czartoryski replied again modestly. I don't care about love or anything else. I just ask you to use your prestige to push the person I choose. Jerome Bonaparte said to Czartoryski in an unquestionable tone, you should know it is not easy for the new Poland to resist the invasion of foreign enemies, and Archduke Maximilian will be the bridge between you and the Austrian Empire. I need you and the Austrian Empire to defend against the Russian Empire. If you can't even meet this requirement, then I can only think about other things. After being silent for a moment, Czartoryski raised his head again and said to Jerome Bonaparte, Your Majesty, can I arrange an interview with the Grand Duke you have chosen for us? I need to fully understand Archduke Maximilian before I can give you an answer. Of course. Jerome Bonaparte nodded to Czartoryski. Maximilian, he is now waiting for you in my office. Czartoryski immediately realized that the reason why Jerome Bonaparte appeared here was to build a bridge of communication between Grand Duke Maximilian and him. The fact that the Emperor was personally involved also explained the attitude of Grand Duke Maximilian himself and the Emperor's heart. If the Grand Duke Maximilian really served as the Grand Duke of the Hua Duchy, then they would be able to live the friendship between the two imperial powers of France and Austria. Your Majesty, I will send my son Wild with you. What do you think? Czartoryski nodded to Jerome Bonaparte with a serious look on his face. Yes. Jerome Bonaparte nodded and said to Czartoryski. Later, Czartoryski called his son Ward. Father. Ward said, standing in front of Czartoryski with a respectful face. You reading www.urkanshu.com. You are now entering the palace on my behalf with our new Grand Duke Maximilian. Czartoryski gave an order to Ward. Yes, father. Ward replied with a nod to Czartoryski. Your Majesty, the dog will take care of you. Czartoryski said. Then, Jerome Bonaparte and Ward returned to the Tuileries Palace by carriage. Jerome Bonaparte, who entered the study, saw Maximilian sitting slightly restrained on the sofa at a glance, and he hurriedly introduced Ward, who was also a bit dazed beside him, to Grand Duke Maximilian. Maximilian, this is Ward, son of Prince Czartoryski. Jerome Bonaparte introduced Ward to Grand Duke Maximilian. Maximilian, who knew a little about the current situation in Poland, immediately realized that this Ward was the spokesperson for Czartoryski, and Czartoryski was now the uncrowned king of Poland. It's a pleasure to meet you. Archduke Maximilian politely extended his hand to Ward. Me too. Ward also stretched out his hand. After the two shook hands, Jerome Bonaparte invited them to sit down together to People, please state your terms. Jerome Bonaparte said to Maximilian and Verd. Here, you can speak freely. Therefore, Archduke Maximilian told Verd on the terms that the Count of Bora and the Duke of Metternich told him in advance that if Prince Czartoryski supported him as the Archduke of Warsaw, he would grant Prince Czartoryski the new cabinet, or the right to appoint specific people to form a cabinet. Chapter 745, Profit Driven. In the face of Grand Duke Maximilian's offer to let his father personally or appoint a specific cabinet, Verd was a little moved. Whether it is his father to form the cabinet himself, which is almost zero because Prince Czartoryski is 84 years old, or to have his father appoint someone to form the cabinet, he will be able to accumulate in the nascent kingdom of Poland. Having a deep network of contacts will also help him in his future political career. The current Verd is only in his early 30s. For an ordinary person, his early 30s may mean that he will achieve nothing in his future life, while for a politician, his 30s are just a golden age of political development. Once the new cabinet appointed by his father was established, Willard had tacitly agreed that his father was incapable of forming a cabinet. Then Willard was fully able to inherit his father's shadow and serve as Prime Minister of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw during his lifetime. This is no better than his wasted life in France. I don't know how much. Grand Duke Maximilian and Jerome Bonaparte, who were sitting beside Verd, looked at each other and smiled after seeing the subtle change in Verd's expression. They knew that Verd was about to be persuaded by the terms of the Grand Duke Maximilian. So, Jerome Bonaparte decided to add another fire to Verd. He looked at Archduke Maximilian and said with a smile, "Maximilians, Archduke." Maximilian, who was interviewed by Jerome Bonaparte, was stunned for a while and then quickly responded, "Your Majesty, who will handle your daily chores in the Habsburgs for you?" Jerome Bonaparte blatantly hinted at Archduke Maximilian. Grand Duke Maximilian immediately understood what Jerome Bonaparte meant, and he hurriedly replied to Jerome Bonaparte, "Your Majesty, my daily chores are all done by myself." "That's not good," Jerome Bonaparte said to the Grand Duke Maximilian. "You are a future monarch anyway. How can you not have someone around you who handles daily trivial matters for you?" "Your Majesty, you are right," Grand Duke Maximilian hurriedly echoed. "I will look for a suitable candidate after I return to Vienna." "Why do you need to go back to Vienna?" "I think Mr. Verd is a good candidate," Jerome Bonaparte said to the Archduke Maximilian, and then added, "What do you think?" After Grand Duke Maximilian pretended to look at Verd, he invited Verd with a smile. "Mr. Verd, I wonder if you would like to condescend to be my secretary." After hearing the invitation from the Grand Duke Maximilian, Verd said to the Grand Duke Maximilian with a trembling mouth, "Your Excellency." "No, Your Majesty, I'm very willing to serve you, Mr. Verd. You will be my first secretary from now on." Grand Duke Maximilian stretched out his hand and said to Verd, "I hope we can treat each other frankly in future cooperation." If the previous Wield was just heartbroken, then the current Wield has made up his mind to help Maximilian become the Grand Duke of Warsaw, because he and Maximilian have become a community of shared interests from the beginning. Of course, he also knew very well that the reason why Archduke Maximilian was willing to let him serve as secretary was simply to use his father's influence to allow him to take over as Archduke of Warsaw with the approval of all parties. However, this is not where his capital lies. It was clear to both him and his father that the successful establishment of Poland did not depend on them, but on the Emperor of France. So they didn't have any choice from the beginning, and the reason why his father sent him here was to hope to sell and get a good price. At least Wilder thinks so. "Your Majesty, I'm honored to be your secretary," Verd said excitedly, holding the hand of Grand Duke Maximilian. "Mr. Verd, what do you think of the conditions just now?" Grand Duke Maximilian returned to the previous question again. "Your Majesty," said Verd respectfully to Maximilian, "my father just wanted to ask you one question." "What's the problem?" Archduke Maximilian asked Verd. "After you become the Grand Duke of Warsaw, what political system will be implemented in the Grand Duchy of Warsaw?" Verd asked Grand Duke Maximilian. Maximilian told Verd, since the Polish political system was different from the French Empire, they could not follow the French universal electoral system. If he were fortunate enough to be the Grand Duke of Warsaw, he would learn from the Orient system of universal elections in Poland. That is, every Polish citizen who lives in the kingdom, as long as he meets the election conditions, the right to vote when the annual tax amount is 100 francs, and the annual tax amount exceeds 200 francs, has the right to be elected, can participate in the election of the Kingdom of Poland election. After listening to Maximilian's words, Verd couldn't help but have more expectations for Grand Duke Maximilian to serve as Polish monarch. Because the system implemented by Grand Duke Maximilian can effectively guarantee the political monopoly of those who have property in Poland, that is, those political elites. Only with the support of the political elite could Grand Duke Maximilian truly take root in Poland. Wild. What do you think? Archduke Maximilian asked Verd. Your Majesty, your idea is very good. Verd replied to Grand Duke Maximilian. Although your idea may not be loved by my father, it can effectively protect the interests of the Polish property owners. Prince Czartoryski, why don't you like it? Archduke Maximilian asked suspiciously. Your Majesty, in fact, my father always wanted to build Poland into a republic. Verd explained to Grand Duke Maximilian, no matter how bad it is, we must build a country with universal suffrage like the French Empire. How? Shall I persuade Czartoryski? Asked Archduke Maximilian. Your Majesty, you don't need to convince my father. Verd shook his head and replied to Czartoryski, in fact, my father called me here with the lowest expectations. As long as you can properly respect the interests of Poland, my father will support you as the Grand Duke of Warsaw. Afterwards, Archduke Maximilian and Verd continued to negotiate for a long time, and the two sides were surprised to develop that their political views coincided in some respects. Both were liberals in a broad sense. As a result, the two discussed more vigorously, and Jerome Bonaparte, who was originally the leader of the meeting, was also put aside. It was not until Jerome Bonaparte coughed twice and pointed to the time of the grandfather clock to tell them that it was almost time for supper that Grand Duke Maximilian and Verd stopped point immediately afterwards. At the invitation of Jerome Bonaparte, Grand Duke Maximilian and Verd accompanied Jerome Bonaparte to dinner. After they entered the restaurant, they saw Augusta, who was already sitting in the restaurant, and they all greeted Augusta. Empress Augusta smiled and invited Maximilian to sit down with Verd. Verd and Maximilian sat on the left and right sides of Jerome Bonaparte respectively. After the dinner officially started, Jerome Bonaparte first proposed to toast the friendship between the French Empire and the Kingdom of Poland, and then proposed to toast the friendship between the French Empire and the Austrian Empire. After 2 glasses of wine, Jerome Bonaparte immediately started chatting. Jerome Bonaparte told Verd that the reason why he chose the Grand Duke Maximilian as the Grand Duke of Warsaw was to ease the relationship between Poland and Austria. In addition to jointly containing the Russian Empire, Grand Duke Maximilian himself was a capable and willing leader of reform. He hoped that Archduke Maximilian and Verd would cooperate sincerely to build a new Poland. The French Empire will also help the newly born Poland within its power. If Poland wants to, they can also provide ample funds for the construction of Poland. Grand Duke Maximilian immediately expressed his gratitude to Jerome Bonaparte on behalf of the Kingdom of Poland. After the dinner, Verd chatted with Grand Duke Maximilian for a while, and then was sent back to Prince Czartoryski's residence by Jerome Bonaparte. Verd, who returned to his residence, was immediately called to the bedroom by Czartoryski and asked, "Have you seen Archduke Maximilian?" Verd nodded to Czartoryski and said, "I see. What kind of person do you think he is?" Czartoryski asked Verd again. "Archduke Maximilian is different from his rigid and ruthless brother. He is a more tolerant person." Verd replied to Czartoryski. "Then did he tell you what political system he was going to implement in Poland?" Czartoryski asked Verd again. Verd immediately relayed Maximilian's words to Czartoryski. Although Czartoryski had some regrets in his heart, he still said, "Not bad. Yes, father. Archduke Maximilian is going to invite me to be his secretary." Verd continued to Czartoryski, "And he also gave you the right to form the first cabinet." Chapter 746. Poland under compromise. Forming a cabinet for the first time. What's the use of me asking for this right? The conditions of Grand Duke Maximilian did not make Czartoryski happy. For an 84-year-old man who did not have a strong desire for power, he only hoped to see Poland independent from the Russian Empire in his lifetime, and then it is enough to establish a republic. However, Poland was indeed independent, but could not establish a republic as he wished. Such a result made Czartoryski feel a little unacceptable. Father, you can use this right granted to you by your majesty, to choose a successor who can execute your will. Verd said to Czartoryski, inherit my will? Hearing Verd's words, Czartoryski's emotions erupted immediately, and a disdainful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. Even my son has betrayed me. What can I do now? I want others to inherit my will. Father, with a shy expression on Verd's face, he said hesitantly, I didn't betray you. I just think. What do you think? Prince Czartoryski scolded Verd unceremoniously. Do you think that your father is too old to be able to help you, so you want to betray him patiently? No. Veld shook his head desperately, squatted beside Prince Czartoryski, and held Prince Czartoryski's hand, and said to him, my respected father, I can swear, the respect and love for you will never change. Everything I do is also to continue your ideals. My ideal? Czartoryski said furiously to Verd. Verd, you have followed me for nearly 30 years. Don't you know what my ideal is? Father, Verd responded sincerely to Czartoryski. I know that you want to turn Poland into a republic without emperors and nobles, but you should also be very clear that it is impossible for Poland to be a monarchy now. Surrounded by the successful establishment of a republic, I can tell you with certainty that the French Empire will never help us, and the Austrian Empire will not give us Galicia Krakow, if you insist on establishing a republic in Poland. So for the sake of the overall situation, I implore you to give up this unrealistic ideal, and choose a safe path. You have only met that Maximilian a few times, so you are so sure that he is the safe way. Czartoryski asked Verd, as if he was deliberately raising his bar. In my opinion, he said, the so-called universal elections are just empty bills. Before he ascends to the throne, when he is firmly on the throne, he will immediately tighten his control over Poland like his older brother, so as to achieve the purpose of his dictatorship. I have seen many such tricks. After listening to Czartoryski's words, Verd shook his head and replied firmly to Czartoryski, Father, although I have only met Grand Duke Maximilian once, I don't think he will be like him. Emperor Franz Joseph. I believe that Archduke Maximilian really wants to lead Poland into modernization, get rid of all the shackles and bad habits that existed before, make Poland strong again. For Verd's answer, Czartoryski was silent for a moment. He sighed again, and his originally angry face returned to its former calmness. Verd knew that his father had let go of the past and began to face the present. After a while, Czartoryski said slowly, Wild. Father. Verd quickly responded to Czartoryski. Tell me honestly, does Grand Duke Maximilian have any other conditions besides this one? Czartoryski said to Verd. In addition to promising to give you the right to form a cabinet for the first time, your majesty also promised to let me serve as his secretary. Verd said frankly to Czartoryski. You promised him? Czartoryski asked, even though he already knew the answer in his heart. Yes. Verd nodded and said to Czartoryski, okay, I get it. Czartoryski patted Verd on the shoulder. Gradually, Verd's childhood face appeared in Czartoryski's eyes, overlapping with the current Verd. Together before he knew it, his son was in his 30s, and he too should have his own path to follow, and his, Czartoryski, ideals should not be imposed on him. Wilder. Looking at Verd who was squatting in front of him, Czartoryski's face showed a relieved smile. Verd, you have grown up. Father, I will always be your son. After feeling the change in Czartoryski's demeanor, Verd also shouted. Immediately afterwards, Prince Czartoryski ordered Verd to go to the study with him. Verd followed behind Czartoryski with a kerosene lamp, illuminating the way to the study for Czartoryski point. After reaching the study, Prince Czartoryski took out a piece of paper from the drawer, and he handed it to Verd. Father, is this? Verd looked at Czartoryski curiously. Didn't Maximilian authorize me to form a new cabinet? Just hand over the names on the list to him. Czartoryski said slowly to Verd. Verd opened the note, and sure enough, the note was the candidates for cabinet ministers and the snobbery behind them. It can be said that with this note, Maximilian will at least take a long detour. Father, when did you write this? Verd looked at Czartoryski in surprise. I wrote this after you left with His Majesty Jerome Bonaparte. Czartoryski said to Verd. Okay. Don't talk nonsense. Tomorrow morning you will give this to Maximilian and follow Maximilian to Vienna. I'll settle things for you in Poland. Father, what are you going to do? Verd was a little worried that Czartoryski was not taken care of. I'll just stay in Paris. Prince Czartoryski replied to Verd, however, your body. Verd was a little worried that there was something wrong with Czartoryski's body. Don't worry. Czartoryski patted his chest and replied to Verd, I won't die in a while. But what's not possible? Czartor scolded Verd again with a face. I didn't have a mother-in-law like you back then, and I always did what I wanted. Having said that, Czartoryski once again told Verd about his great achievements in 1830. What every old man likes to do in his spare time is to brag about his past. At noon the next day, Verd appeared again at the Tuileries Palace to meet Maximilian. Your Majesty, this is the list of members that my father asked me to give you. Verd handed the list to the Archduke Maximilian. Archduke Maximilian, like Verd, went over every member of the list carefully. After a while, Archduke Maximilian smiled and said to Verd, thank you to Prince Czartoryski for me. Later, Verd told Archduke Maximilian that his father had expelled him and that he was now homeless. Maximilian immediately understood what Prince Czartoryski meant, and he immediately ordered Verd to go back and prepare, and they would leave for Vienna tomorrow. Your Majesty, I'll go back and prepare right away. Verd replied to Grand Duke Maximilian, then turned around to prepare to go back. That's right. Maximilian suddenly stopped Verd, and under Verd's suspicious gaze, he handed Verd a gem. You give this to your father Czartoryski. Your Majesty, I can't ask for anything from you. Verd hurriedly rejected the gift from Grand Duke Maximilian. Reading www.urkanshu.com. It's not for you. It's for your father. Maximilian insisted on handing over the gem to Verd. Tell Lord Czartoryski that I, Maximilian, are very respectful. He is a patriot. Although this gem cannot make up for the enthusiasm and money he has invested in the Kingdom of Poland over the years, it also represents a little bit of my own thoughts. Please be sure to bring this gem to your father. Under Maximilian's firm gaze, Verd accepted the jewel of the Archduke Maximilian, and then bowed solemnly to the Archduke Maximilian. On behalf of my father, I would like to express my gratitude to His Majesty. After speaking, Verd turned and left. After Wilda had left, Count Bauer appeared in the room of the Grand Duke Maximilian and asked about the progress of the Grand Duke Maximilian. I finally know why he can be loved by most parties in Poland. Maximilian handed the list to Count Bauer. Count Bauer glanced at the list and found that most of the people on the list were not members of Czartoryski's party, but Czartoryski could treat them as ministers equally. Prince Czartoryski really has a heart that ordinary people don't have. Count Bauer also sighed with emotion. Returning home again, Verd handed the gem to Czartoryski and told Czartoryski exactly what Archduke Maximilian said. Czartoryski nodded slightly and warned his son to keep a cautious attitude in Vienna and not to be arrogant. Because there is no one in this world that cannot be replaced. Chapter 747, Swedish Ambitions. After the Polish issue was properly resolved, it was no longer necessary for Maximilian and the Count of Bauer to remain in France. So, on the fourth day after the christening, the Archduke Maximilian and the Count of Bauer bid farewell to Jerome Bonaparte. Thinker, are you leaving so soon? Although Jerome Bonaparte had already known that Maximilian and the Count of Bauer would be leaving in the near future, when Maximilian really bid him farewell, Jerome Bonaparte was still slightly in his heart a little lost. Your Majesty, thank you very much for your help during this time. Grand Duke Maximilian said sincerely to Jerome Bonaparte. No one knows better than Maximilian that, if it weren't for the help of Jerome Bonaparte, it would be really difficult for Maximilian and the Austrian Empire behind him to gain the support of Prince Czartoryski. It was precisely because of the pressure of Jerome Bonaparte that Prince Czartoryski gave up his dream of a republic and instead supported Grand Duke Maximilian as King of Poland. It was also through this communication that Maximilian discovered that the influence of the French Empire on Poland was greater than he thought. It's just a matter of hands. Jerome Bonaparte waved his hand lightly and said to Archduke Maximilian, I sincerely hope that you and Queen Augusta can come when I inherit the Grand Duke of Warsaw. Grand Duke Maximilian once again sent an invitation to Jerome Bonaparte. Don't worry. I will definitely go with Queen Augusta. Jerome Bonaparte nodded, and then added, by the way, please help me tell Mr. Boer, I hope he can answer me as soon as possible about the currency union. I'll tell Count Boer on your behalf, replied Maximilian. Then, under the arrangement of Mocha, Maximilian and the Count of Boer got into the carriage to the Paris train station. They will travel by train from Paris to Strasbourg, and then via Strasbourg to Germany. The day after the departure of the Grand Duke Maximilian and the Count of Boer, Queen Katerina also said goodbye to Jerome Bonaparte and Augusta. Sister, will you stop playing for 2 days before leaving? Yeah. Cousin, why don't you play for 2 days before leaving? Jerome Bonaparte and Augusta graciously retained Queen Katerina. Queen Katerina shook her head and replied to Jerome Bonaparte and Augusta that the reason why she stayed in Paris for so long was entirely to attend the baptism of Prince Frederick. Now that the baptism was over, it was time for her to return to the Netherlands. Seeing that Queen Katerina insisted on leaving, it was not easy for Jerome Bonaparte and Queen Augusta to keep them forcibly. Cousin, be careful along the way. I hope you can come with your brother-in-law next time. Augusta and I will definitely greet you. Jerome Bonaparte said politely to Queen Katerina. Understood. Queen Katerina replied sullenly, and then said to Jerome Bonaparte, by the way, you asked me to ask about the monetary union, and William has already replied to me. Huh. Jerome Bonaparte was instantly refreshed, and he hurriedly asked kindly, what did my brother-in-law say? Queen Katerina gave Jerome Bonaparte a sullen look and responded, William said that the Kingdom of the Netherlands does not exclude joining France to form a currency union in principle. However, the premise is that the currency alliance you form must first have a certain number of countries to join this alliance. Jerome Bonaparte opened his mouth slightly. He originally wanted to win over Belgium, the Netherlands, Sardinia, and the Pope, and then attract more countries to join them. Now the Kingdom of the Netherlands has to wait until the currency union is slightly formed before joining it. Isn't this just wanting to pick up ready-made ones? If every country thinks like the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Jerome Bonaparte's currency union plan will probably die in the womb. Cousin, I'm sorry. Queen Katerina said to Jerome Bonaparte, the Kingdom of the Netherlands is different from the French Empire, and William's rights are also different from yours, so the monetary union is very important, and must go through. It can only be passed with the consent of the parliament. Okay. Jerome Bonaparte shrugged to Queen Katerina and responded helplessly, I can only do my best. After Queen Katerina left Paris, Jerome Bonaparte locked himself in his study, thinking about the possibility of joining a currency union country. Sweden? This should work. Spain. When there was a knock on the door, Jerome Bonaparte stopped thinking and said to the door, come in. Mocha's figure appeared at the door. Your Majesty, Duke Snasser from the Kingdom of Sweden wants to visit you. Duke Snasser. Jerome Bonaparte pondered for a moment, then suddenly remembered that the so-called Duke Snasser was not the future King Carl XV of Sweden. The reason why he chose this time to come is probably because of the Finnish problem. Invite him in, said Jerome Bonaparte to Mocha. Yes, Your Majesty. Mocha nodded, then turned and left. After a while, Duke Snasser appeared in front of Jerome Bonaparte. Judging from Snazzer's appearance, he did bear some resemblance to Marshal Berthier. Could it be said that it is now popular to inherit from generation to generation? Looking at the Duke, who looked somewhat similar to the Imperial Marshal in front of him, Jerome Bonaparte silently complained in his heart, Your Majesty. Duke Snasser, who was introduced by Mocha, was also stunned for a few seconds after seeing Jerome Bonaparte's first glance, and then quickly returned to bow and salute. Duke Snasser, come and sit. Jerome Bonaparte beckoned to Duke Snasser. Duke Snasser hurriedly trotted to Jerome Bonaparte's side and then sat opposite him. Immediately afterwards, Jerome Bonaparte deliberately pretended to be ignorant and asked Duke Snasser what he had to do with him. The Duke of Snasser told Jerome Bonaparte that he had come to visit His Majesty Jerome Bonaparte by order of his father. Duke Snasser, thank your father King Oscar for me. Since Duke Snasser was unwilling to reveal his true purpose, Jerome Bonaparte had to incarnate the topic Terminator, and responded to Duke Snasser. The Duke of Snasser once again expressed his gratitude to Jerome Bonaparte, and then tactfully told Jerome Bonaparte that in addition to being ordered to visit Jerome Bonaparte, there was also an offer from Jerome Bonaparte. Bonaparte asked what he was going to do with Finland. Dealing with Finland? Jerome Bonaparte responded calmly. The handling of Finland should be discussed in 2 months, not now. But, I heard from the British Prime Minister Palmerston. Dukes Nasser said impatiently to Jerome Bonaparte. Mr. Dukes Nasser. Jerome Bonaparte said to Dukes Nasser coldly, since you have received the exact information from Palmerston, you should really follow closely in the behind Britain. Why come to Paris in person, Duke? Nasser heard Jerome Bonaparte's displeasure, and he quickly apologized to Jerome Bonaparte. Duke Nasser, you don't need to apologize. Jerome Bonaparte continued to put on a posture of keeping strangers away. I understand and respect the choice of the Kingdom of Sweden. The original Marshal Berthier did not rely on it only by betraying the interests of France in exchange for Russia's understanding. In the face of Jerome Bonaparte's ridicule, even though Dukes Nasser felt extremely humiliated, he still smiled and said to Jerome Bonaparte that something did happen to his grandfather Bel. Thierry confronts his colleagues in France. You read www.canchu.com, but he could assure Jerome Bonaparte that his grandfather never spoke ill of the emperor at the beginning of Dukes Nasser's account. Berthier told him the story of the emperor who led them to conquer most of Europe. My grandfather has always respected His Majesty the Emperor. Dukes Nasser said to Jerome Bonaparte, the reason why he chose to be the enemy of His Majesty the Emperor at that time was also out of a helpless choice. Your Majesty, the Kingdom of Sweden does not want to be hostile to any country. Since Sweden does not want to develop a hostile relationship with any country, then I think it is in the interest of the Kingdom of Sweden that Finland should become an independent principality. Jerome Bonaparte sees the loophole in the needs of Dukes Nasser. Dukes Nasser, Your Majesty, the people of our country are all looking forward to the return of Finland. Dukes Nasser replied to Jerome Bonaparte. What? You are not afraid of the hostility of the Russian Empire? Jerome Bonaparte raised his eyebrows and asked Dukes Nasser. Afraid? Dukes Nasser said briefly, and then added, however, we are even more afraid that Finland will not be able to return smoothly. Any responsible Swede would not want to see Finland left behind. Jerome Bonaparte asked Dukes Nasser again, then how are you going to resist the malice of the Russian Empire? The Duke of Nasser told Jerome Bonaparte that his father hoped to get the help of the French Empire and the Kingdom of Britain, and only in this way could he be able to resist the Russian Empire. If the French Empire is willing to act as the strong backing of the Kingdom of Sweden, they are willing to give the French Empire the most favored nation treatment for iron ore. Chapter 748, French-Swiss Customs Union. Iron ore. Jerome Bonaparte smacked his lips and responded to Dukes Nasser. This condition sounds pretty good, Your Majesty, so you agreed? Dukes Nasser asked excitedly. Promise? Jerome Bonaparte turned to a surprised expression and responded to Dukes Nasser. Dukes Nasser, you misunderstood. I just said that this condition sounds good, not I promise you. If you only want to pay the price of iron, or in exchange for the French Empire to provide you with security, I still advise you to die as soon as possible. Jerome Bonaparte's response was unequivocal, causing Dukes Nasser's originally joyful heart to fall into an abyss. He knew very well that if he wanted to win Finland completely, he had to rely on the army of the French Empire as the backing. Otherwise, even if Finland was won, the Kingdom of Sweden would have to live a life of worrying and guarding against the Russian Empire all day long. Your Majesty, what do you want? The Duke of Nasser gritted his teeth and asked Jerome Bonaparte. Mr. Duke of Nasser, it's not what you want, but what you have. Jerome Bonaparte replied, it is true for us in France that your Kingdom of Sweden has high quality iron ore. Important, but not to the point where we can protect you against the pressure of the Russian Empire. Don't forget, the Kingdom of Britain also has iron ore. We can totally import from the Kingdom of Great Britain. Under the direction of Jerome Bonaparte, the current French Empire is accelerating into the fast lane of industrialization. Several cargo ships carrying iron ore and coal came to Paris from London. Therefore, although he himself hopes to pass a large amount of Swedish iron ore, he will not put the whole of France in for the iron ore point unless Nasser is willing to cooperate with him more deeply, such as the customs union. Your Majesty, apart from iron ore, our Kingdom of Sweden seems to have no other valuables. Dukes Nasser replied to Jerome Bonaparte. Duke Nasser, I'm tired. You can leave. Jerome Bonaparte responded to the Duke of Nasser with a cold face. After speaking, Jerome Bonaparte made a gesture of request To leave. Dukes Nazar had no choice but to nod and leave Jerome Bonaparte's office. After a while, Jerome Bonaparte called Mockad again and then gave him an order to invite Foreign Minister Walewski to come. Moka led the way and left, and after another half an hour or so, Walewski appeared in Jerome Bonaparte's study. "Your Majesty, what are your orders?" Walewski asked Jerome Bonaparte. "That's it." Jerome Bonaparte replied to Walewski, "Just now, the Duke of Snassa came to me and wanted to ask for our help. I told him that he had to pay some price. Who knows, this Elm's head doesn't know anything at all. I really don't know if people who live in Sweden all year round will be fooled by the cold wind." Walewski listened quietly to Jerome Bonaparte's complaints about Duke Snassa, and soon Walewski extracted key information from Jerome Bonaparte's remarks. "Your Majesty, do you want to sign a customs union with the Kingdom of Sweden?" Walewski asked Jerome Bonaparte. "Yes." Jerome Bonaparte nodded and said to Walewski, "Sweden's iron ore and coal are both things we are in short supply, so I want to sign a customs union agreement with them, using to meet the needs of the domestic market." Walewski immediately understood that the reason why Jerome Bonaparte was willing to sign a customs union with Sweden was because he was interested in the market of the Kingdom of Sweden. After all, the Kingdom of Sweden has nothing that France needs other than iron ore and coal. However, the high value-added products of the French Empire were indispensable to the Swedish aristocracy and middle class. Once the Kingdom of Sweden signs a customs union with France, the trade protection barriers established by the Kingdom of Sweden for high value-added products, commonly known as the luxury goods industry, will no longer exist. The products of the French Empire can easily invade the territory of the Kingdom of Sweden and completely defeat the local luxury goods industry of the Kingdom of Sweden. After all, when Britain and France implemented the Free Trade and Commerce Treaty in history, all fronts almost completely collapsed, and only the luxury goods industry continued to export to Britain. The luxury goods industry in the Kingdom of Sweden is far from that of the Kingdom of Great Britain, let alone that of England and France. Once the customs union was concluded, the Kingdom of Sweden would find that the money France had paid them for iron ore and coal would soon be back in their hands. Since ancient times, the world has been a resource-based country that cannot be a high value-added country. "Your Majesty, I understand." Walewski nodded and replied to Jerome Bonaparte, "Okay, then it's up to you and Duke Snassa to talk slowly." Jerome Bonaparte said to Walewski. Walewski got up and left Jerome Bonaparte's study. A week later, the Duke of Snassa appeared in front of Jerome Bonaparte again. At this time, he was worse than when Jerome Bonaparte met him, both in terms of mental outlook and state. A big chunk. Obviously, this week has not been a good one for him. "Duke Snassa, what's the matter with you?" Jerome Bonaparte asked Duke Snassa hypocritically. "Your Majesty, it's nothing." The Duke of Snassa responded with a reluctant smile, and then said to Jerome Bonaparte, "Your Majesty, we can completely accept the conditions that you asked Walewski to give me. I promise you. Then, why do we sign a treaty?" Jerome Bonaparte asked Duke Snassa. After the meeting, Duke Snassa replied to Jerome Bonaparte, "And my father hopes that the French Empire can sign a secret agreement with the Kingdom of Sweden." "Secret agreement?" Jerome Bonaparte asked Duke Snassa in confusion. "Yes." Duke Snassa nodded and said to Jerome Bonaparte, "I can assure you that this agreement only applies to the Russian Empire, and as long as the Russian Empire does not invade the Kingdom of Sweden, this agreement will not be exposed before." "Okay, I promise you." Jerome Bonaparte nodded and replied to Duke Snassa. Afterwards, the Duke of Senna sent his blessings to Jerome Bonaparte. "Your Majesty, I hope that the French Empire and the Kingdom of Sweden can unite and help each other in the future." "I hope so too." Jerome Bonaparte echoed. In the following period of time, Jerome Bonaparte received replies from the Kingdom of Belgium, Sardinia, the Papal State and Switzerland, and they all expressed their willingness to join Jerome Bonaparte. The European Monetary Union formed by Bonaparte. As for the Austrian Empire, they were still skeptical about the so-called European Monetary Union, so they did not choose to join it immediately. On the contrary, Palmerston, Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Great Britain, had some interest in the European Monetary Union formed by Jerome Bonaparte. In order to understand the nature of the currency union, Palmerston sent Ambassador Coates to ask Jerome Bonaparte currency union thing. Jerome Bonaparte frankly told Ambassador Coates that he was setting up a currency union, and he also invited the Kingdom of Great Britain to join the currency union. After learning that the currency union was nothing but a tactic by France to expand its own market, on the surface, Ambassador Coates obviously lost interest in the currency union. After all, Britain is not like France, its overseas trade can make more money than France. Therefore, Britain does not need to strengthen economic exchanges with European countries like France. Of course, this will save him a lot of unnecessary trouble. And it will also make it lose the possibility of uniting Europe. Britain after World War II was too isolated from the European continent, which led to the continuous reduction of its presence and economic status in Europe. Of course, although Britain has no interest in creating a unified currency in Europe, it is interested in destroying the unity of the European currency. Under Palmerston's instructions, the Kingdom of Hanover sent a veiled message to North Germany not to join the European Monetary Union. This further alienated the Kingdom of Prussia, which had no interest in the currency union formed by Jerome Bonaparte. Reading www.urkanshu.com. However, this is also good news for Jerome Bonaparte, who had no intention of bringing the Kingdom of Prussia into the monetary union. Time passed quickly, and it soon came to the end of March. There was less than a month left until the Paris conference. Looking at the calendar hanging on the wall, Jerome Bonaparte was determined to stop all the unimportant work at hand and devote all his attention to organizing this conference to the meeting. This was the first large state conference to be held in Paris since 1815. Even the conference of 1815, France only participated in that conference as a loser. And this meeting was held by France as the unquestioned victor, and its significance to France is far greater than that of the 1815 meeting. Therefore, Jerome Bonaparte has to go all out. So, Jerome Bonaparte called the Minister of State Fulton and the Minister of Finance Magnet respectively, and asked them about the budget for holding such a meeting. Fulton Magnet told Jerome Bonaparte that this was the first time for the Second Empire, so they had to go as far as possible, so they suggested a quota of 10 million francs. Jerome Bonaparte agreed to Fulton's proposal, but he was not prepared to let the government spend the money. Fulton Magnet immediately understood what Jerome Bonaparte was getting. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 749, Alternative War and Peace. Jerome Bonaparte, who had drawn up the amount required for the budget, immediately invited his lacking dogs to come to the Tuileries Palace to discuss the specific procedures of the Paris Peace Conference, full name, Association for the Post-War Treatment of the Russian War. The invited people include industrial capitalists and bankers, and it can be said that there are many talents. When Jerome Bonaparte appeared in the conference hall, everyone present saluted Jerome Bonaparte. Under everyone's attention, Jerome Bonaparte sat on the throne step by step, and then slowly said, "Everyone, the purpose of inviting you here today is to discuss with you what to do with this meeting to maximize profits." Speaking of this, Jerome Bonaparte glanced at the people present and said with a smile, "Every one of you present is an elite of society, and I can't keep up with you in terms of making money. I hope we can work together to make this Paris Peace Conference a success. Your Majesty, you show your love." As one of the representatives of industrial capitalists, Baron Schneider. Schneider had been canonized as a baron by Jerome Bonaparte due to the overall planning in the Crimean War, took a humbly step forward. Jerome Bonaparte responded, "The reason why we have achieved what we are now is all because of your wise guidance. Without you, we wouldn't be where we are now." As soon as Schneider's tout ended, the industrial capitalist camp immediately shouted, "Without Bonaparte, there would be no tomorrow for their entrepreneurs." In the banker camp, except for a few bankers with St. Simon's thoughts, many bankers' faces flashed a trace of displeasure, because the money subsidized by the French entrepreneurs is cut from their flesh. As for the railway alone, after the railway bonds were frozen, the big bankers who held railway bonds could only grit their teeth to maintain the railway, and their bankers had already put in nearly 100 million francs coupled with the various interest rate loans introduced by the government for entrepreneurs. It has reduced their profits to a minimum point, if it wasn't for Jerome Bonaparte relying on the wartime system to freeze the channel for transferring large amounts of gold, and if these bankers were able to transfer losses by investing in Austria, they would have been unable to withstand the damage of low interest rates. After all, a profit that doesn't meet expectations is a loss for a banker. Many bankers have secretly criticized the Second Empire's policy of implementing meat-cutting subsidies, but they can only secretly complain. If you really want them to choose to support the Republicans and the Orleans, they dare not. Jerome Bonaparte, who was praised by Baron Schneider, went to show a pleasant smile, and then rebuked these industrial capitalists with a straight face and said, "I didn't ask you to come here to hear you sing praises to me. I want to do you have any suggestions, Your Majesty? What do you want the Paris Peace Conference to look like?" Baron Schneider asked Jerome Bonaparte with a serious face. "I want to hold a meeting that can not only demonstrate the national strength of the French Empire, but also carry forward the traditional characteristics of France." Jerome Bonaparte thought for a while, and replied to Baron Schneider, "In short, this meeting is different from the previous ones. In any game, we must highlight a new word, Your Majesty. It is easy to solve the problem of showing national strength." Baron Schneider replied to Jerome Bonaparte, "We can hold another military parade." "Another military parade?" Jerome Bonaparte frowned, pondered for a moment, and then nodded to Schneider. "Just do as you said, but if we only hold a military parade, will it make others think that we in France only know how to show our national strength by showing force? We in France are not Prussia and Russia. We not only have to show the outside world our superiority in force, but also our cultural superiority and institutional superiority. Only in this way will others follow us willingly." Cultural advantage? Institutional advantage? Baron Schneider was stunned for a few seconds when he heard Jerome Bonaparte's words. "That's right." Jerome Bonaparte nodded and said to Baron Schneider, "Force is just hard power, and culture is the real soft power. Relying on tone cannot effectively defeat the enemy, but culture can subtly invade the enemy. Our French culture is the invisible blade that can truly defeat the enemy." After listening to Jerome Bonaparte's words, everyone present subconsciously felt a chill behind their backs. That's right. Jerome Bonaparte suddenly realized something. He patted his thigh and said to Baron Schneider, "We can move the upcoming century exposition forward by a month, and it won't work." Baron Schneider, "What do you think?" "Your Majesty, I have no problem." Baron Schneider, one of the exhibitors of the World's Fair, replied to Jerome Bonaparte, "However, I'm afraid that some foreign exhibits are not ready." "It's nothing." Jerome Bonaparte shook his head and replied to Baron Schneider, "This fair will last for half a year, enough for them to come over." Under Jerome Bonaparte's decision, the Paris Century Exposition originally scheduled for May 11th was moved forward by a month. Then, Jerome Bonaparte asked Isaac Perel, a banker, what he thought of the decision. Isaac Perel told Jerome Bonaparte that he unconditionally supported Jerome Bonaparte's decision. Immediately afterwards, Jerome Bonaparte euphemistically proposed to the industrial capitalists and bankers present to solicit donations, and promised that everyone who solicited donations would be recorded. Only then did the industrial capitalists and bankers understand why Jerome Bonaparte only saw them come, but did not call the ministers after a long time of trouble. It turned out that they were asked to collect donations. However, since His Majesty the Emperor has already asked them to collect donations, how could they refuse? So the industrial capitalists and bankers present gave generously. During the entire fundraising event, Jerome Bonaparte received a total of 15 million francs, 5 million francs more than he expected. France will never forget your contributions. Jerome Bonaparte quietly reserved and thanked everyone present. In the next few days, Jerome Bonaparte announced that he would hold the World's Fair, which was originally held in May, 1 month ahead of schedule. At the same time, he set up the Paris Peace Conference Preparatory Committee. He himself served as the leader of the committee. The senior provincial official, Baron Horseman, served as the deputy of the committee, and the funds available to the organizing committee were 10 million francs. The entire organizing committee, led by Jerome Bonaparte, and under the command of Baron Horseman, worked out the venue and pre-conference arrangements for the Paris Peace Conference at a very fast speed. Soon the time came to April 10th. Less than 10 days before the opening of the Paris Peace Conference, and less than 1 day before the Paris Century Exposition, on this day, Fouad, the foreign minister of the Ottoman Empire, and Cava, the prime minister of the Kingdom of Sardinia, arrived in Paris ahead of schedule. Jerome Bonaparte immediately ordered them to be taken separately to the Tuileries Palace. The first person to meet Jerome Bonaparte was Ottoman Foreign Minister Fouad. Mr. Fouad, please sit down. Jerome Bonaparte invited Fouad to sit down, and then asked, what is the current situation in the Ottoman Empire? Thanks to you, everything is going well. Fouad replied deferentially to Jerome Bonaparte, the Russian Empire has now gradually withdrawn from the lands it previously occupied, and our troops have also occupied it. Crimea, that's good. Jerome Bonaparte said to Fouad with a smile, this time the peace meeting is just a process. You don't need to have much psychological burden. I see. Fouad nodded, and then politely asked Jerome Bonaparte if the Danube Principality had no room to turn around. It can be seen that the Ottoman Empire still wants to try to recover the Danube Principality. After all, if the Principality of the Danube can take back the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire's fiscal revenue will be much more abundant. It's a pity. Jerome Bonaparte shrugged and said to Fouad, the Danube Principality is destined to become the territory of the Austrian Empire. If your Sultan is willing to take over the great cause of resisting the invasion of the Russian Empire from the Austrian Empire, then it is not inconceivable. That's fine. Fouad sneered. How could the Ottoman Empire, which had already seen the capabilities of the Russian Empire in the Crimean War, be willing to take over the banner of resisting Russia from the Austrian Empire? Then there's nothing to talk about. Jerome Bonaparte replied, and then added, if I were you, I would consider joining forces with the Austrian Empire to contain the Russian Empire. But between us and the Austrian Empire, Fouad hesitated. Isn't what happened between you and the Austrian Empire back then? Jerome Bonaparte said nonchalantly, as long as you are willing to unite, everything can be turned over. I see that on the Slavic issue, your two countries have a lot to be united with. This. Fouad hesitated for a moment, then said to Jerome Bonaparte, I'll try it. At the end of the conversation, Jerome Bonaparte asked Fouad if he would like to join him in the opening ceremony tomorrow. The opening ceremony? You mean the opening ceremony of the Century Expo? Fouad asked. Apart from this, there seems to be no other opening ceremony. Chapter 750, Cava's sugar-coated cannonballs. It is my honor to witness history with you. There was a grateful expression on Fouad's face. Jerome Bonaparte invited him to participate in the Century Fair without doubt, to give them the opportunity to show themselves to the whole of Europe. As long as he can seize this opportunity, he can refresh Europe, the country's inherent cognition of the Ottoman Empire. It's nothing. Jerome Bonaparte said generously, and then he seemed to suddenly remember something, and immediately asked again, by the way, do you want me to reserve an exhibition area for you too? Your Majesty, don't use it anymore. Fouad said embarrassingly, they really didn't have anything worth exhibiting. Well then. Jerome Bonaparte replied to Fouad with a shrug. Then, Fouad said goodbye to Jerome Bonaparte, who ordered Mocha to send Fouad out of the Tuileries Palace. After Mocha returned to the study, Jerome Bonaparte gave Mocha an order to invite Prime Minister Cava over. Mocha left after taking orders. After half an hour, Cava was taken to Jerome Bonaparte's office. Your Majesty. Cava respectfully saluted the uncrowned king of Europe in front of him. Seeing Cava's humble attitude in front of him, Jerome Bonaparte inevitably felt a trace of guilt in his heart. The Kingdom of Sardinia under the leadership of Prime Minister Cava has reached the point of obedience to France, but he still wants to continue to persecute the Kingdom of Sardinia for the benefit of France. From a personal point of view, Jerome Bonaparte's approach is indeed a bit inauthentic. Sit down, please, said Jerome Bonaparte to Cava in a friendly manner. Yes. Cava trotted across to Jerome Bonaparte with a fat belly and sat down on a chair. The whole process is quite comical, so Jerome Bonaparte can be sure that Cava is definitely doing it on purpose, and the purpose is nothing more than to win his smile and increase his favorability. However, Jerome Bonaparte did not make fun of him because of this. Instead, he had a little respect for Cava in any case. The fat man in front of him is really trying his best to grow Sardinia. Cava, who was sitting across from Jerome Bonaparte, looked at Jerome Bonaparte's serious expression and couldn't help but feel a little frustrated. He didn't know when he would be able to impress the monarch sitting opposite him and let him willingly help the Kingdom of Sardinia to complete the great cause of unification. Just when Cava was sighing for the unscheduled unification of the Kingdom of Sardinia, Jerome Bonaparte's voice reached Cava's ears. "Mr. Cava, you are in Sardinia. How is your situation? Your Majesty, thanks to the grace of my Lord and Manuel, I can still serve as the Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Sardinia." Prime Minister Cava replied to Jerome Bonaparte. "That's good." Jerome Bonaparte nodded and said to Cava straight to the point, "I know the purpose of your visit this time, so I am not going to interfere in any of your actions. But I still hope that you can wait for a suitable time. Now that European peace has just come to us, any country that wants to start a war again will inevitably be sanctioned by the whole of Europe. Your Majesty, please rest assured." Cava hurriedly assured Jerome Bonaparte, "I will never cause you trouble." Immediately, Cava continued to Jerome Bonaparte in a pleading tone, "But I hope you can see that the Kingdom of Sardinia and the French Empire fought side by side in Crimea before Cava could finish speaking. Jerome Bonaparte raised his hand and interrupted. "Mr. Cava, I understand what you mean, but we must start from the bigger picture. I can assure you that I will talk to the envoys of the Austrian Empire here. Fight to get you either of Venice and Lombardy by peaceful means. Your Majesty, if you can really take Lombardy and Venice from the hands of the Austrian Empire, we in Sardinia will definitely offer Savoyard, Nice, and even Sardinia with our hands." Garfu the Prime Minister also assured Jerome Bonaparte. In this way, two unreliable guys reached an unreliable verbal agreement. After the Apennine Peninsula came to an end, Jerome Bonaparte also discussed with Cava the invitation to attend the World's Fair with him, and Cava, like Foot, agreed to Jerome Bonaparte's invitation. "See you tomorrow, Monsieur Cava." Jerome Bonaparte euphemistically issued an expulsion order to Prime Minister Cava. Prime Minister Cava stood up, bowed to Jerome Bonaparte, and left. In the evening, when Jerome Bonaparte and Vernier met again, he found that Vernier had a strange necklace hanging on his nose. Jerome Bonaparte did not remember himself. "I gave her this necklace, Vernier." Jerome Bonaparte gently hugged Vernier in the empty corridor. "Your Majesty." Vernier, who was hugged by Jerome Bonaparte, rested his head on Jerome Bonaparte's chest. "Your necklace is really a good match for you. Which discerning fellow gave it to you?" Jerome Bonaparte asked Vernier, pretending to be surprised. "Your Majesty, this was specially given to me by my cousin." Vernier replied to Jerome Bonaparte. "He also said that this necklace is a perfect match for me, so he gave it to me. So that's how it is." Jerome Bonaparte said sternly. Feeling the indifference revealed in Jerome Bonaparte's words, Vernier hurriedly took off the necklace and handed it over to Jerome Bonaparte. "Your Majesty, why don't I return it to him?" "No." Jerome Bonaparte smiled, put the necklace on Vernier's neck again, and then praised, "It's more beautiful than before." Vernier's face showed a hint of shyness, and then he gradually put his lips towards Jerome Bonaparte's lips. Just when the two were about to kiss, there was a sound of the door opening from a room in the corridor, which scared Jerome Bonaparte and Vernier away quickly. "Cough, cough, Vernier, go do your own thing." Jerome Bonaparte cleared his throat and said to Vernier, "Yes, Your Majesty." Vernier turned and left immediately. Jerome Bonaparte also returned to the study to handle official business until 11 o'clock in the evening. With exhaustion written all over his face, Jerome Bonaparte slowly came to Queen Augusta's bedroom. Just as he was about to push the room away, he suddenly realized that entering at this time could easily affect his son's rest. Once Friedrich gets up, he doesn't have to think about rest in the second half of the night. So, Jerome Bonaparte gently left Queen Augusta's room and returned to his own room. After he pushed open the bedroom door, Queen Augusta was lying in his room. Jerome Bonaparte was stunned for a few seconds and then asked Queen Augusta why she was here. It stands to reason that she should now be sleeping with Frederick in her own room. Frederick has been settled by me, Queen Augusta said to Jerome Bonaparte with a smile. Jerome Bonaparte swallowed subconsciously. As a visitor, he didn't understand what Augusta meant, but he was so tired that he really didn't want to pay the public rations. Cough, cough, I think it's time to rest, Jerome Bonaparte said to Queen Augusta, biting his head. Queen Augusta quickly got up from the bed, grabbed Jerome Bonaparte, and laid him down on the bed, and then took off his clothes one by one. Soon, Jerome Bonaparte's militia missiles were already raging under the deliberate provocation of Queen Augusta. Now that he had no choice but to let him go, Jerome Bonaparte had no choice but to say to Queen Augusta, "I'll do it." After that, he took off Augusta's clothes one by one. Reading www.ucanshu.com while helping Queen Augusta get rid of the burden. Jerome Bonaparte found that Queen Augusta also had a necklace that he had not seen before hanging on her nose. However, now is not the time to pursue the necklace. A strong hormonal scent permeates the entire bedroom. About 20 minutes later, the wonderful voice stopped. Jerome Bonaparte, who held Augusta in his arms, exhaled and asked who gave him the Augusta necklace. Queen Augusta told him that the necklace was given to him by Princess Mathilde, whom Mathilde said was commissioned by Cava. It seems that the sister side has been completely opened up by Cava. Jerome Bonaparte couldn't help but admire Cava's silent means of accepting bribes. Now the largest Italian group in the entire French court should be his sister. If he hadn't traveled through history, he might have been really moved by Cava's perseverance to help him fulfill his desire to unify northern Italy. It was precisely because he came from a later age that he knew that once the Austrian Empire left the Apennine Peninsula would inevitably be unified by Sardinia. No matter how hysterical Sardinia says, the Apennine Peninsula must not be unified. Jerome Bonaparte doesn't want to create two enemies out of thin air. A unified Italy will inevitably oppose France because of the problems of Savoy and Nice, and the Austrian Empire will also be opposed to France because of Lombardy and Venice. What's wrong? Queen Augusta asked immediately after noticing the change in Jerome Bonaparte's expression. No, nothing, Jerome Bonaparte said to Queen Augusta with a smile. Since Cava likes to give gifts, let him give enough. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.